Muslims also have like prophecies, right? Like end times prophecies.
Okay, yeah.
Nice. Okay, what are they expecting? Like the Christian perspective's it's been around forever and everybody knows it, right? And like, geez, America especially, that there's going to be like an end of the world, there's going to be an antichrist, a mark of the beast, a rapture, things, Jesus comes back, right? Those are kind of the primary tenets of Christian eschatology or end time stuff. What are like Muslim or Islamic prophecies about the end times?
Okay, so there's also an antichrist called Masih ad-Dajjal, who will be, waging a war against the Muslims. And there'll be a guy called the Mahdi, who is sort of chosen by Allah to kind of like fight against him. And then Jesus will come back over Damascus.
Jesus will?
Jesus will.
Not Muhammad?
Not Muhammad, Jesus. Because Jesus never died in the Islamic framework. So he did ascend to heaven, and he's going to come back over Damascus.
Oh, man, so many questions.
And the Hadith says he'll break the crosses and kill the swine, meaning that he'll like abolish Christianity and all the Christians will become Muslims.
Wow. So do they think the Antichrist is Christian? Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Menace the Menace. We've got another great interview today with James Rayment. And today's topic is going to be kind of just an in-depth historic and overview of Islam and the faith and the history. And also just some questions from like a Christian perspective about the faith and the religion, and just curiosities that I've had over the years. And I've engaged with some Muslim friends as well. So I've always been curious because, it's one of the 3 Abrahamic religions. So they're kind of in the same wheelhouse, but as we'll find out today, not necessarily exactly the same. And so hopefully it'll be an interesting discussion. I've got James Rayment here. So I wish I had my applause button, but I didn't cue that up. So James, I'm sorry you don't get an applause today. Don't hold it against me. But thank you for being here. And James, do you want to give us a quick little intro into who you are, what you're doing, and why you're the guest speaking about Islam and the history of that faith?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So my name is James Rayment. I live in Seattle, and I run a nonprofit ministry called the Al-Maidah Initiative. You probably want to write that down so people can look it up.
Yeah, how do you spell that?
AL-MAIDAH.org. And the reason we picked a ministry name, which is not possible to spell for non-Arabs, is really because we want to use that name as kind of connection point from people from a different culture than us. So Al-Maidah in Arabic means a table full of food and conversation. And that's essentially what we do, is we get Christians and Muslims together over food to have meaningful and in-depth conversations with each other. We are a Christian ministry, right? We make no apologies about being Christians. We believe that Jesus is the path to God and the only way to God. But we also believe the Bible commands us to show hospitality to people who are different than us, to think carefully about other ideas, and to have a high standard of truth and communication when we're talking to people. So it's important for us not to make caricatures of Muslims, to fairly represent what Muslims believe and build a conversation that's based on listening, accurately representing what people believe, and hopefully that will allow us to accurately represent what we believe to Muslims. Because if you look at the average Christian, they have a lot of misconceptions about Islam and the Muslim world.
For sure.
Muslims have lots of misconceptions about what Christianity is, what the Bible is, and what we believe. So we're trying to build robust conversations which thoughtfully engage these things, not in sort of, shallow comment war sort of style, but in sort of in-depth things that are explored through honest friendships and conversations. Our motto is conversation without compromise.
Do you feel like the Muslim community is like pretty accepting of that? Do respect that, appreciate it, or is it more kind of like hesitation?
Really, it's going to depend on who you're talking to.
Mm.
I would say most Muslims love the idea of that.
Mm.
Some Muslims do not like the idea of it at all. And the reason for that is some people's Islam is kind of based on really trying to avoid hearing other opinions, and therefore they have this very simplistic approach to the world, and having serious interactions with other ideas is going to be something that they're actively discouraged from. There's a lot of Muslims, though, especially in somewhere like Seattle, which are quite happy to have meaningful conversations and be honest and be friends and to have honest, respectful conversation. And then there's some people who like the idea of it and then just kind of like, tap out after a while. What we do is not for everybody, but we always have plenty of people who are willing to talk to us and have fun doing so. That's
cool. Yeah, I love that. And you were recently on the Cultish podcast, right? There was like a multi-series, I guess, episode, but it was multiple episodes, or multiple episode series, let's say it that way. And you guys got pretty deep and in depth, I don't know how deep we'll get, but I'm excited for the conversation. I've got a little bit of like a presence online on like social media and stuff. And so I get a lot of Muslims that will like comment or respond to some of my stuff. And so I've engaged with them a little bit, but like you said, Christians tend to have a general bias, or things that they've been told about the Muslim community. So then when I hear stuff that they're saying, I'm like, dude, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. And so I've kind of been, it's almost like providentially going down this path of learning more and more about like Islam. And then here you are, which is great. It's another step in this pathway, I guess. And then I've spoken recently to a guy named, have you heard of a guy named Beck Lover? I keep saying Lever. He's kind of a social media figure, but he's Muslim as well. But I like this thing that he said on a interview he did on the Concrete podcast. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but he was saying that there's so much happening in the world right now that Christians and Muslims can be united over rather than being like at odds over, and he just called to this general unity between Christians and Muslims, even though we disagree on certain things, but just for the sake of fighting against like the clear and present evil that's at hand. And I'm like, dude, that's the first Muslim guy I've ever heard say that we need to like unite because there's some really bad stuff happening right now. And so we communicated on that, or about that. And he was going off on a lot of like the history of the Muslim community. And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, I just let him keep going, because he was a guest on the show and I wanted to hear what he's got to say. But I was totally clueless. And I'm just like, but can we talk about the unification thing because of the evil that's happening? And then I reached out to you and you're gracious enough to come on. So I really appreciate that. I'm really hoping to learn more about the history of the Muslim faith, kind of how it came about. And hopefully I could re-engage back on another day, you know what I mean, with more knowledge. So how about we start there? Like, as a Christian, I don't know anything about the Muslim history. I don't know. I just know Muhammad. I know Quran. And I know what the American government has told us for the past few decades. You know what I mean? But that's all I know. So would you think, let's start there. Let's start with like, what's a brief history of the Islamic faith? How about that?
So I've got to really work hard to control myself here because I'm currently working on a video about Islamic history, and I've read like 1,000 pages of Islamic history in the last week. And like and I'm like so in it right now that I'm having like Islamic history dreams. It's ridiculous. But like first caveat, because I can like predict the comment section of what's going to happen here. I'm going to tell you the history of Islam from the Islamic sources. And there's a lot of people online in the Christian internet right now who do not believe that Muhammad ever existed.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's a very popular theory in both the sort of secular academic world and the sort of Christian sort of missions and YouTube world, right? That's a big thing. And I'd say two things to those people off the bat. The first is that when we study the history of Islam, we're not examining everything, and not everything we're examining we're examining because we believe it's the absolute truth, but because what people believe about history influences them. So even if you don't believe Muhammad existed and all the sort of history is kind of revisionist, which I don't believe, right? I believe Muhammad existed. I believe the history is accurate in the broad strokes. You still need to understand how it motivates people. And it's relevant because people believe it, whether or not you believe it happened. So you should understand what Muslims think of their own history, even if you don't believe it, right? I don't believe everything that Muslims believe about their own history. I do, however, want to understand it as they understand it. Secondly, I think when people use the higher critical method, right, which is this sort of hyper-skeptical methodology developed in sort of 1800s Germany to examine history, basically it's like, I won't believe something about history unless you can show me through the archaeology. I don't think it's that it feels very powerful in critiquing something in the moment, but I don't think it will work long term, because when people started criticizing the Bible, Christians were caught flat-footed by this because no one had to defend it to that point. But once people start thinking in these terms and doing the research, these things do start getting verified. And I think this feels like a very powerful argument right now because Muslims haven't even been thinking about it. But I think once they do start thinking about this more, I think this will become an argument that's kind of weaker and weaker. And so I think people shouldn't be putting all their eggs in that basket. The jury is still out on the evidence being presented. So that's my caveat going in.
Sure.
But the actual kind of Islamic history from the Islamic sources, right? So this is complicated because there is no biography of Muhammad written until about 100 years after his death. At least none that survive, right? And then you have the Hadith, which are correlated about 250 to 300 years after his death, which are reports of his life. And then you have the first sort of big Islamic historian called Al-Tabari, who is in 930. So basically 300 years after Muhammad's death. Now, Al-Tabari is referencing earlier histories, but those things are lost to us now. So it's important to understand that's where the Islamic sources are. And what I'm presenting is it will be an authentic reflection of those books. And a Muslim listening might say, well, I don't agree with this, I don't agree with this. And that's fine, but I'm not making this up from my own imagination. I'm referencing the earlier sources. And the fact is, if you don't like those earlier sources, there aren't really any alternatives to those sources. So sorry for doing that for a while, but let's actually get to the story because it is interesting. So the premise of the beginning of Islam is that Arabia is like the Wild West of the ancient Near East. And it's kind of like this borderline lawless place that's run by this various tribal societies living all over the subcontinent.
What year are we in right now?
Right, we're in about 570. So Muhammad is born in the year 570.
Okay.
And Arabia is largely polytheist. They believe in lots of gods. And Mecca, according to the Islamic sources, is the sort of center of this polytheistic religion, where every year all the tribes will go there in peace and make offerings to the various gods in the pantheon, right? Muhammad is an orphan, but he's part of a well-connected tribe. And then when he's 20, he starts working as a merchant for a woman named Khadija, who is so impressed by him that she marries him. And when he's about 40, he is praying in a cave because he's already a monotheist and he's not really sure what religion to follow.
He's a monotheist in a polytheistic tribal environment?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Now, he wouldn't be the only one because there are some Jews and various kind of branches of Christians living there.
Mm.
And when he's praying in this cave, an entity appears to him and tells him it's the angel Gabriel. And it says Iqra, which means recite. And he says, I don't know how. It says Iqra again. It says, I don't know how. And then finally, he says Iqra the third time, squeezes him so he feels like he's going to die. And then he starts to recite the words of the 96th surah of Quran, saying, God created humanity from a clinging clot, and there's only one God. And then he's initially freaked out by this and goes back to his wife Khadija and tells her, cover me, Khadija, because I'm possessed by the spirit of a jinn or a poet. Both of those things are kind of niches to Arab culture. But Khadija calms him down, and she sends for her uncle, who's an elderly Christian monk or priest, and he actually tells Muhammad that your coming has been foretold in the Bible, that you are chosen as God's prophet and you need to speak courageously and you'll face rejection by your people.
That's what his uncle was, a Christian priest?
His wife's uncle.
His wife's uncle or cousin was a Christian priest. So he was familiar with like Christianity to some extent?
Yes. And also think about, he's a merchant, right? So on his merchant journeys, he will go up from Mecca all the way to Syria. So Syria was majority Christian at that time. So, you think about his journeys, what he's going to be doing is sitting around campfires, telling stories, right? And a lot of the stories he's going to hear are going to be Jewish stories, Christian stories, all sorts of, both things from the Bible and also kind of like, legends.
Right.
And when you read the Quran, you'll see what seem kind of like oral retellings of Bible stories and also extra biblical stories kind of like work their way into the text. So an example of this is, do you remember the time where Abraham was thrown into a fiery furnace, but he was unharmed by the fire?
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Right. So that's not in the Bible,
Right.
but it is in the Jewish, in the sort of Jewish midrash, right? So or in the Talmud. It's a sort of Jewish folk tale about Abraham, where the tale of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego has been put back on Abraham, and that story is in the Quran. Also, there's this Christian story, which comes from about 500, called the Seven Sleepers of Ephesus, where Christians are being persecuted by the Romans, and 7 men go and go to sleep in a cave, and they like wake up 200 years later when all the Roman Empire is Christian, and they're like, what the heck has happened here? And that story also makes it into the Quran as well. So Muhammad is clearly immersed in the sort of culture of his day, which isn't simply, Arabia has always been a culture of merchants, and he that's literally what his job was before he became the quote unquote prophet.
Yeah, because one of the things you'll hear is, or that I've heard, is that Muhammad, he couldn't have taken from the Bible because there's, like you said, there's some overlap, right, with some Judaism and some Christianity. There's certain quotes or stories that are also they find their way in the Quran to some degree, and they say there's no way, because Muhammad wasn't literate, right? He couldn't read. That's what I've heard. So there's no way that he he read it from the Talmud or from the Bible and then just copied it into the Quran. But it's obvious that if he had family who was a Christian priest, and if he was a merchant traveling, and it was still like an primarily oral tradition, like what's it called when you transmit things orally rather than having it written down?
Yeah.
Oral transmission, whatever it's called.
Yeah.
If that was still the way that information was transmitted and history was transmitted in stories and religion, it would make sense that he would be aware of Judaism and Christianity, even if he doesn't have the ability to read those texts.
Right. So when you read the stories about like biblical characters in the Quran, it 100% reads like a guy who's been immersed in the sort of oral traditions of these things, and not in the actual text of these things. Right. That's how it comes across. It's how you'd expect it to come, which is it's a, some information is kind of like, blended together. Some information is kind of added or sort of like grows. Now the Muslim angle on this is, of course, that it's actually the text of the Bible that's been corrupted, and the Quran is actually preserving the truest version of this. And people are going to believe what they're going to believe, but again, if you just compare the stories next to each other, the Bible comes across as a written source, meaning that if you read Exodus, like the account of Moses, look through the Bible and observe every single reference to Moses in the Bible after the Torah, and you'll see that details actually don't get added. It's always consistent in what it's referencing, as if people are reading a book that they're referencing, right?
Got it.
Because they are, right? Because it's a written document.
Right.
Whereas when stories are passed down orally, they tend to sort of gain additional details, right?
Sure.
The Bible is generally a pretty bare bones account, and oral stories tend to be, very, very colorful because details get added over time for the sake of storytelling. And that's exactly how the Quran reads when it comes to, recounting Bible studies. Details are blurred together, they become more colorful, all that kind of stuff.
Okay, got it. So he gets this vision of the angel in the cave. Wife's uncle or cousin says, "Hey, this is from the Lord. You're chosen. You're going to be persecuted." And then what?
So for the next 3 years, he's kind of explaining his ideas or what he believes are the revelations to this sort of close circle around him, and his daughters believe him. His nephew Ali believes him, and then and a friend called Abu Bakr and Uthman believe him, and then he starts taking these more publicly, and then controversy kicks off because Mecca's economy really comes from the idol trade, right? It's a religious economy. So the guy saying, all these gods are false, and the one that is true you can't build a statue of, it's not good for business, right? Same thing in Acts 18 when Paul is preaching in Ephesus, right? It's like,
right,
we're going to lose our livelihood if we keep saying this. So the Muslims, the people that believe Muhammad, start getting persecuted by the Meccans. But Muhammad himself is not persecuted because he has connections. His wife Khadija is very well connected and respected, and his uncle Abu Talib, who's Ali's father, is also well connected. Now, Abu Talib is not Muslim, doesn't become Muslim, but he nevertheless says, "I'm not going to let anything happen to my nephew, Muhammad." So, Islam kind of keeps growing, kind of slowly under persecution at that point. But then in 621, both Khadija and Abu Talib, Muhammad's circle of protection, die. And Muhammad is in trouble at this point. But what will happen is, as different tribes come to Mecca, he'll kind of like loiter by the wells and have conversations with these tribal leaders. And according to Ibn Ishaq, the way this happens is that there's a tribe from a city called Yathrib or Medina with a sizable Jewish population there. And the Jews have been telling the Arabs, according to the sources anyway, that a new prophet's going to arise. And when that happens, the Jews will become the masters of the Arabs. And the men of Yathrib, who are Arabs, say, okay, well, this is the prophet the Jews have been telling us about. And we're going to be finished unless we agree to follow him before the Jews do.
Oh, they thought that Muhammad was the prophet that the Jews were speaking of?
Yes.
Interesting.
And they thought, okay, if we believe in him first, then we'll defeat the Jews rather than the Jews defeating us.
Oh, wow.
So they say, hey, you come to Medina and or Yathrib, which is Medina later, and we'll accept you as a prophet. And Muhammad agrees to this, but then gets another revelation, and he goes and tells them, not only do you have to accept me as a prophet, you also have to agree to fight for me and be an army for me as well. So at this point, Muhammad has been preaching one God over many. He's been a one-woman man, and it's been mostly peaceful up until that point, right? There is an incidence of violence where a Muslim actually attacked a Quraysh mocker, but it wasn't like commanded by Muhammad, right? Muhammad himself had been, peaceful and, enduring suffering with patience, right?
Right.
So up until this point, Muhammad in a lot of ways looks like an ideal Christian in some ways.
Sure.
But then when he goes to Medina, that's when things really start to change. He becomes the absolute ruler of religion and state in the year 622, and that's when it becomes a sort of military force as well.
Do you think that he was he told, I don't know if it says this kind of detail in these texts, was he told in a revelation to request this kind of military allegiance, or was that kind of his own volition because he's lost protection of his wife and family?
No, he says it's a revelation.
This is from the revelation. Has he been getting continuous revelation this entire time, or
Yes.
was it kind of the whole time?
Yeah,
because this is about what, 10 years later?
Yeah. So basically, the way the Quran works is it's not a narrative. I was expecting the Quran to be like the sort of Muslim version of the Bible. When I first read it, I thought it'd be like the story of Muhammad and all the rules, and it really isn't at all. It's all like prose poetry, and it comes in bits and pieces throughout the course of his life. So the majority of it comes in Mecca, or the majority of the sort of chapters come in Mecca. But then Islam really starts to develop in Medina. So it's kind of this idea of kind of progressive revelation throughout the course of his life. One circumstance arises, a revelation comes, and he writes it down, or he narrates it, and sometimes other people write it down for him. And so that's the Quran. The Quran is not finished at this point. The Quran is in progress.
Okay, cool. So we're in Medina, and he gets the revelation and tells people that, hey, you need to fight for me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, next.
So all the Muslims are poor refugees at this point. And so in order to kind of avenge themselves and reclaim some of their property, they start raiding the Meccan trade caravans that are going to Syria. And as people are, as this happens, that provokes the Quraysh to come out and fight the Muslims. The Quraysh is the tribe he's from in Mecca. And there's 3 battles. The first, the Muslims win against all odds. The second, the Muslims lose, but not decisively. And then the third, the Meccans come all the way to Medina, but the Muslims build a trench, outmaneuver, the army, and then make a treaty called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which basically makes peace between them and allows them to just kind of spend the next few years expanding their spheres of influence, which Muhammad does very, very, very well through a series of missionaries, or raids, of battles and expeditions. And a tribe affiliated with the Quraysh attack a tribe affiliated with the Muslims, so their proxies fight, and this leads to the Muslims declaring war on the Quraysh. And Muhammad marches to Mecca with an army of 10,000 men, surrounds the city, and then they actually, they surrender and agree to convert to Islam, and it's mostly peaceful. There are 5 to 12 people who are assassinated, depending on which source you believe. Different hadith say different things. But in general, it's a bloodless victory. And so then there's a couple more strongholds to take, but at this point, Muhammad is the master of all Arabia, and he's starting to set his sights elsewhere. So they fight one battle with the Byzantine Empire that Muhammad is not present at, called the Battle of Mu'tah, where Muhammad's former adopted son, died, and then he gets ready for an expedition to a place called Tabuk, but that doesn't materialize into anything. The Byzantines are not there, and then Muhammad starts the sickness that leads to his death during that time frame. So, while he's in Medina, right, he was a one-woman man in when he was in Mecca. When he moved to Medina, he became a polygamist. He married up to about, I believe it's kind of 11 to 13 women, depending on the source. He also had some concubines as well, including an Egyptian Christian woman who bore him a son, but that son died when he was 2. I
wonder if he went polygamist because now his wife, who was like the matriarch of his household, she was wealthy, she was his protectorate, and now she's gone and he's kind of free, and he's the one gaining power in Medina. So now he starts taking women for himself. You know what I mean? Whereas before, this woman that married him and was kind of his protector, probably, was it normal for them to have multiple wives even then?
Yeah,
in that territory?
Yeah, it was normal, and probably and
I wonder if she just didn't want him to have more wives. You know what I mean?
So,
but now she's gone. So
there's all sorts of reasons you could allege for that.
Yeah,
but I would make an argument that if you read the Muslim sources, Muhammad also really, really, really loved her. Right. So it's easy just to kind of like look at all these things Muhammad did and try and assume some sort of cynical motives behind all of them. But I think it's the mother of his children. He felt she was the one who stood by him when he was still a struggling artist, right? It's like he clearly had genuine affection for her,
right?
And he just wasn't in a position, right? He wasn't powerful at that point. So the rationale is not necessarily like super well explored, but some of these marriages do actually serve a political purpose too.
Well, now that he's expanding and he has ambitions, it makes sense that now he's now he's taking wives that expand that political motive, So that makes sense.
Right. It's not just that, because people say it's only that, which it is, right? That's a true part of it.
It's a part,
but it's not all of it.
Sure.
You don't take concubines for political purposes, right? It's just Maria the Copt is a gift from the ruler of Egypt. He sent him 2, and it's like, oh no, I can't take sisters as concubines together. I'll pick one and give this one to someone else. Right?
Wow.
Muhammad's marital life is complicated.
Sure.
There's factions that form among his wives. Aisha is his favorite wife, and the Sunni sources say that she's 9 years old when they got married, which is very plausible because there's other examples at the time of Muslims marrying, young, right? And so it seems to be like one of the rules in that society. Like the second a girl has her first period, she's kind of married off.
That wasn't just in the Muslim society. That was pretty common in that day and age in a lot of places. I think the Jews married super young too.
Yeah. It's a sort of a young age of
for sure
of marriage.
Yeah, marriage was for procreation and for security and to produce children and to produce children that would help you raise your flock, take care of you when you're older. It wasn't just like it is today where it's like, oh, I met somebody I really get along with and we're of the same age and have great discussion. That's not what marriage always was back in the day.
There's still some of that though, but yeah. So it's like, so this is something people often kind of get very stuck on with Muhammad. And again, the sources do say that he married a 9-year-old girl, right?
Right.
You can criticize that, and I do, right? I don't think that's a good thing, but it's important that we don't, single out Muhammad in this as well. Also, it's important to understand that that's not something that's universally agreed upon by Muslims either. So, for example, Shias believe that she was older. Well, like a lot of Shias believe she was older, and they believe the Sunnis lowered her age to make allegations of infidelity seem less plausible, for example. Right? Or that she may have exaggerated her own age in order to sort of seem, to kind of, make her place seem more special. Or, right? There's a whole bunch of people that go back and forth inside of Islam itself, right?
Right.
It's important if you're going to engage in that conversation that you have a category for, okay, not all Muslims believe this, not all Muslims celebrate this, not all Muslims have a particular position on this. So you've got to have a wider view if possible on that if you're going to be talking to people about it.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know. For me, it wasn't that big of a sticking point because I think we're reading a lot of our cultural norms into the past, where, like I said, back in the day, lots of people took younger wives. Even, I don't know how old they say Mary was when Joseph was engaged to her. I think they say she was like 15, 16, 14, somewhere in that range, I've heard. So it's like, I think the barrier for marriage was your first period as a girl. So once that happened and you're ready to be a mother and produce children, I think you were ready to be married according to most cultures. And today we see that and we're like, oh, that's, Epstein status. But it was just the norm of the day for a lot of places. So I'm not defending it, but I'm also, I also get it historically and culturally, so.
Right. So from the Islamic sources, like Omar, for example, marries Muhammad's granddaughter, who's, about 11 when the marriage takes place. So, I would have a different standard of judging that, but you can't pin this uniquely on Muhammad, right?
For sure. I totally agree.
If it's a sin, it's a cultural sin, right? It's not like a unique individual sin. It's something that he's a product of his time.
For sure. Okay, so he takes over all of Arabia, right? Starts setting his eyes to expand Islam, has some battles with the Byzantines. And then you said he died at some point. How old was he when he died?
I think he was 63.
60. So his whole thing lasted from 40 to 63. So about 23 years, give or take?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
And so the Sunni sources say that he was poisoned by a Jewish woman after a battle where the Muslims kind of defeated a Jewish settlement, took it over. And the effect of that lasted for 2 years. So after kind of taking a final pilgrimage to Mecca from Medina, he died on the lap of his favorite wife, Aisha. And then there was this void in the Muslim community that no one could fill. And part of the difficulty of what came next is that you have an expectation that there is some sort of succession, but not a very clear outline of what that actually is. So Abu Bakr is his best friend and is the one Muhammad has lead the prayers when he's sick. And so one faction believed that he was the best person to lead. Then you have his nephew Ali, who was, close to him and, Muhammad will say things, if you obey me, you'll obey Ali too, and he'll kind of put him under his cloak, and these are the people of my house, my Al-Bayt, and so both these people believe that they have a right to succeed Muhammad. Also, another guy called Sa'd ibn Ubadah, who is the leader of the people of Medina from before Muhammad's time, says, well, yeah, we were the OG people who supported you. We should be the leaders of Arabia now. So he starts together a sort of council to elect him as leader of the Muslim community. That is crashed by Abu Bakr and Omar, and they say, no, people aren't going to follow you. You need to have someone from the Quraysh. So that results in Abu Bakr being proclaimed as the caliph, the successor of the Khalifa, the way that the Muslim would generally say that. And Ali is, meanwhile, not at this meeting and is preoccupied with Muhammad's burial. And so he's reluctant, but eventually, after Omar going to his house and threatening to burn it down, he agrees and pledges allegiance to Abu Bakr. Then, the whole Arabian Peninsula, except for a few cities, say, all right, we're not paying your taxes anymore. We're going to appoint our own prophets. And they all leave the sort of Islamic system. They don't go back to the old religion. They keep monotheism, but they ignore the Muslim leadership, right?
So there was religious and political unification, right?
Yes.
So it wasn't just we need a new prophet. They also needed new governance, new military leaders, new all of that, right? So were any of these guys seen as prophets the same way Muhammad was?
So the Muslims, among the Muslims, no. And that was what the war was about, is that each tribe basically appointed its own prophet and says, all right, this guy is the prophet now. Or this woman is the prophet now.
Okay.
And so that leads to a year-long war called the Apostate Wars or the Ridda Wars, where Abu Bakr leads the Muslim forces to kind of reconsolidate power over Arabia. And they win that war. And the sort of biggest battle of that war is called the Battle of Yamama, which I always find funny. And in that time, right, the Quran is not written down yet. It's all memorized.
Oh, really?
And according to the Islamic sources, 800 men who memorized the Quran died in this battle. And so that's the trigger that causes Abu Bakr to decide to start writing down the Quran. And then it's kind of mostly gathered at that time, except for a couple of verses. And then it goes to Hafsa, the daughter of Omar, the widow of Muhammad. Abu Bakr does launch a preliminary campaign into Iraq and Syria. They take Damascus. They take large parts of Iraq. So at this part of the war, they're mostly fighting other Arab tribes who are sort of auxiliaries of the Byzantines and the Persians. And then Abu Bakr dies, and then a guy called Omar becomes the Khalifa. And Omar is this very severe, very, very ascetic guy, major micromanager. Is just a stickler for the rules. So one time, Muhammad's granddaughter and Omar's wife, he's 50 something at this point, and she's a teenager. She actually has a postal correspondence with the empress of Byzantium, Constantinople, and she said they exchanged gifts through the mail, and then she sends it. The empress of Constantinople sends her this beautiful necklace, and Omar says, You're using the public postal system for personal correspondence. You can't have this necklace. This must go into the state treasury, and stuff like that. And he's spying on all his governors, and he's watching their personal behavior. There's this general called Khalid who takes a bath and rubs wine on himself as a soap, and he gets a letter from Omar being like, "Why are you washing yourself with this substance?" Right? It's that's the kind of guy he is, but he's also super effective. And under him, the Muslims eliminate the Sassanid Empire, the Persians, and they take Damascus, they take Jerusalem, they take Egypt, and you have massive expansion within a 14-year period. That's how long his reign lasts.
Are they seeing this as are they receiving revelation to do these conquests and to expand, or is this just political purely?
It's so basically Muhammad sort of set the example, right? So there's a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari where it says, I've been ordered to fight the people of the book until they say La ilaha illallah, meaning until there's only one God. So the seeds of the Muslim conquests definitely come from Muhammad's time, and he has these campaigns seeking out these things. So the Muslims are not getting new revelations, but they're kind of continuing what Muhammad started, basically.
Got it. Okay. And they're collecting taxes as well along the way.
Yes.
Okay.
So the basic MO of the early Muslims is when they go into a place, there are three options. You can convert to Islam. You can, if you're a Christian or a Jew or a Zoroastrian, like a monotheist, you're allowed to keep your religion if you pay tax. Not if you're a polytheist. Or you can die or leave, basically.
Wow. And were they always, did they always have so much like animosity, or did they always bump heads with like the Jews so much in particular? Or did they kind of go to war with everybody equally? Christians, Zoroastrians, everybody equally?
Okay, that's a good point. So initially, when Muhammad was alive, right, there were three tribes in Medina who were kind of like rivals to power. And Muhammad ends up sort of exiling two of the tribes and killing a third tribe. And the pretense for those is that they have been the ones to betray him. However, he's informed of this betrayal through a divine revelation, right? So Gabriel comes to him and says, this tribe is about to betray you. This tribe is about to try and, assassinate you. So, if you believe that God is speaking to Muhammad, then, fair enough. Yeah. If you don't believe that, it would feel like a bit of a, subversion of due process if you're a Jew at that time. Be like, what? The angel told you we're going to betray you? What?
Yeah.
How do we defend ourselves against that, right?
Exactly. But our angel said we're not. So, okay. So that was those were Jews that he went after. Those were the different tribes.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, in general, but actually, the real enemies of Muhammad are the polytheists, right? That's who's really has the animosity, with.
Get them.
So, Muhammad is willing to tolerate Christians and Jews so long as they're paying taxes.
Is that because they were also monotheist?
Yes, that's the rationale the Quran gives anyway.
Okay.
They're called the Al-Kitab, the people of the book. And the early Muslims did not believe in forcing their conversions. They were certainly incentivized to convert, and they'd pay less tax if they converted.
Nice. Good deal.
Yeah. But they were allowed to continue being Christians and Jews.
Okay, got it. Okay, so in the history, where would you say, where did it go? You've mentioned multiple times the what are the two like primary sects of
Sunni and Shia?
Okay, when did that occur?
Okay, so the seeds of that start when Abu Bakr is chosen as Khalifa instead of Ali. But then after Omar was assassinated by Persians, right? So people that resented his role in the Persian Empire assassinated him. Omar chose 6 people and says, pick the caliph from among you. So there's a guy called Uthman, there's a guy called Ali is in that, who the Shia believe was the rightful successor. Ali himself believed he was the rightful successor. A guy called Al-Zubair and a guy called Talha, who all kind of come together to pick the next Khalifa. And Uthman is like the anti-Omar. in that he's just sort of super laid back and, wealthy and kind to everybody and tries to solve all problems with money, basically. And because people are so sick of living under being micromanaged, and so a few years into the reign of Uthman, people start to resent that he's kind of giving his relatives positions of authority, that he's privatizing public grazing lands for the state treasury. And they also don't like the fact that Uthman has collated the Quran. So the Quran used to be in like 7 different dialects, and Uthman collated it, put it out exclusively in the dialect of the Quraysh, and burned everything else.
I mean, we'll get into this more when we talk about the Quran, but was it, so you said it was in 7 different dialects, but were they all like verbatim translations, or were they kind of different?
Well, it's different dialects of Arabic. So there's sort of different ways of recitations, and to be honest, what exactly that is, it's a little bit, mysterious to us.
Okay.
And so there's controversy over that.
Okay.
Too.
We'll get into the Quran later, and I digress, I guess.
Yeah. But I would say that in general, the Quran actually isn't really the most massive thing. I think generally the sort of core of the Muslim community, like the OG Muslims, are still around. They're generally on the same page with Uthman about what he's doing. There's a guy called Ibn Masud who's not, but even then the differentiations are kind of like Uthman's Quran has like 2 more chapters than his do. But the substance isn't really something that's argued over.
Got it.
But people argue with Uthman about him disobeying the Quran, becoming an unbeliever, and he says, no, you're taking this out of context. And so Uthman's problem is he listens to everyone's advice. So his cousin Muawiyah and Marwan give him advice, and he says, okay, yeah, it sounds good. But then Ali comes in and says, no, their advice is bad, listen to my advice. And he goes and does that, right? So there's 3 cities that are planning to overthrow Uthman. There's the Egyptians who want Ali to be caliph. There's the Kufans who want Talha to be caliph, and there's the Basrans who want a guy called Al-Zubair to be caliph. And they all kind of come together. And the Egyptians come, and they want Uthman to step down. And he says, why? And they kind of basically outline their beef with him. And he says, okay, I'll think about it. And so Ali tells him, all right, go and repent for all of your evil in the mosque in a sermon, and then invite everybody who has grievances to come speak to you. So he does this, and he says, all right, I'm sinned. I'm the first to repent. I want to make things right. Everybody who has complaint against me, come to my house and we'll work each and every one out. And he goes back home, and his cousin's like, you want my advice or should I be quiet? And he's like, I don't know, give me your advice. And his cousin says, look, you're a humiliated man submitting to humiliation, and it'd be better if you just kind of keep doing what you were doing rather than embarrassing yourself by doing this. And he says, like, okay, but you go speak to him. I don't want to speak to him. So Marwan goes out and says, you will get nothing from us. You're trying to steal our property, and we're stronger than you. And this starts this, riot, which ends with Uthman being besieged for, 40 days in his house. Ali, and then there's a mob of these Egyptians doing this. And the leader of this mob is Abu Bakr, the first caliph's son, and the brother of Muhammad's favorite wife, Aisha. And Ali married Abu Bakr's widow and became father to Muhammad ibn Abu Bakr. And eventually, this mob breaks into Uthman's house, and Muhammad grabs him by the beard and says, you're going to pay for what you've done, you hyena. And Uthman says, don't grab my beard. Your father would not have done this. He would not have treated me this way. And I intend to do much worse than this. And then Muhammad ibn Bakr stabs him in the head with an iron tool. Jeez. And then the mob of people, start, and one of them rips his wife's hijab off as she's trying to protect him.
Jeez.
And then Uthman is murdered while reading the Quran, and his blood drips onto the Quran as he dies. Now, some accounts say that Muhammad ibn Abu Bakr changed his mind partway through and did not partake in the killing. From the sources, it kind of seems like he did, but he's at least part of the mob that murdered Uthman, right? Sure. Even if he's not the one that delivered the final blow.
Sure.
And this is significant because he's Ali's son, adopted, godson at this point. So, Uthman's cousin Muawiyah is the governor of Syria. And he's back in Syria, and the people of Medina need a new leader. And so they go to Ali and they say, hey, you're the best guy for the job. And he says, no, just let me be an advisor. And they say, no, it has to be you. The Muslims need a leader. The community is in crisis. It needs to be you. So he accepts the job in the mosque. And Ali hates Muawiyah, the governor of Syria, has like a long-standing beef and suspicion of him and like demands he step down. But Muawiyah is saying, I'm not stepping down. The city was taken over by a mob and my cousin was murdered. Mm-hmm. I'm not stepping down. I'll submit to you when you when you hand over to me Uthman's killers, because I have the right of revenge here by Islamic law. So this leads to a civil war between Ali and Muawiyah. And Ali is a better soldier and a better general than Muawiyah is, but Muawiyah is a much smarter politician. And so they meet at something called the Battle of Siffin, where Ali is winning, but then Muawiyah's forces advance with pages of the Quran attached to their lances and saying, we demand arbitration under the authority of the Quran. Ali's troops, who are much more zealous than Muawiyah's troops, basically can't say no to this. And then this leads to this, political squabbling among Ali's side, which ends up that his faction basically fractures, where Muawiyah just kind of gains more and more, strength. Then eventually, Ali is assassinated by some people from his own faction called the Kharijites. And then Muawiyah becomes caliph. Ali's son Hassan decides that he doesn't want to fight and basically, agrees to let Muawiyah be caliph in exchange for like $5 million in peace. No, it's 5 million dirham, so that's like $15 million.
Good deal.
Yeah, it's a good deal. So there's 20, and so Muawiyah, according to all the historical sources, the Islamic sources kind of hate him, but all of the Christian sources love him. Because Muawiyah was a super sort of tolerant leader, and he was good to the Christians. He established sort of peace in his reign and had Christians in his government as well. And Muawiyah is the first character we have like hard archaeological evidence of, and Muawiyah's coins have crosses on them. Here's an inscription from him in Jerusalem in Greek it starts with a cross on it. And so he's clearly somebody who appreciates Christians, who respects their culture, and you have 20 years of peace. But then Muawiyah designates his son Yazid as his successor, and Hassan has been poisoned at this point. No one knows by who. And then Ali's son Hussein is invited by the people of Iraq to go and be their leader and oppose the Khilafah of Yazid, Muawiyah's son. But he's met by a very small force of like 80 people. And then Yazid's general butchers Hussein and his family, including his young baby. And this creates this basically void between the people who believe Ali and his family should be the rightful leaders versus the people who believe in the sort of arbitration of the community. And that's never been put back together since then.
And are those the two factions within it, like the two primary, the Shia and Sunni?
Yeah.
Which one's which?
So the Sunni are the people that are the majority, like 85% of the world Muslims. And then they're the ones that believe that were kind of on that believe the community in general should choose its leaders, right? And the Muslim community as a whole should be guided by the wisest Muslims. And then the Shia are the ones that believe the family of Ali should be, and their descendants should be, the leaders.
And they're in the minority right now?
About 12%. Then the third largest group is a group called the Ibadi Muslims that kind of came from this faction that are like, you know what, all you guys are bad leaders. We don't want any part of this. Some of them were violent, some of them were peaceful, and that actually became the basis for the state of Oman today. That they're not Sunni or Shia; they're a different faction.
Wow, interesting. Did Muhammad have any sons?
He had 2 sons, both of whom died in childhood.
Okay. Do you think, I mean, obviously this is just speculation, if he had sons, do you think there'd be as much infighting within the Muslim community after he died? Or would the sons have just taken over, kind of?
It's really hard to say. I mean, I would guess they are, because Hussein was Muhammad's grandson.
Right.
So his daughter Fatima married Ali, and they had descendants. So I have, it was a very hard culture to hold together. It was a culture that was very martial. It was very military based culture.
Sure.
And I think it would have been difficult for them to maintain, even if he had direct descendants.
Yeah. Was there any, we were saying earlier, the reason they were so militaristic was because Muhammad kind of set that example for them, right, in expanding Islam. Was there any precedent, even while Muhammad was alive, for a lot of the infighting and arguing and the nepotism and the overthrowing? And where did they get justification for that?
So that I would say there's not really precedent for that in Muhammad's life. He very much believed in sort of unity and cohesion and obedience to your leaders. But there's lots of there's in one surah of the Quran it says, fight those who cause fitna in the land. And fitna just sort of means disorder, corruption, evil, right? It's kind of a vague term.
Yeah.
So the people who killed Uthman used that as their justification.
Got it.
Right. So the Quran doesn't contain its own context. So it's
what do you mean by that?
So okay, so if you read the latter half of Exodus, say, the context for that is the first half of Exodus. When you read the Psalms, the context for that is 1st and 2nd Samuel and everything that's come before it. When you read the New Testament, the context for it is the Old Testament. So if you let's take say I'm trying to think of a good example here. So let's say we have Jesus' command to turn the other cheek, for example.
Yeah.
Right. That's in the context of somebody who believes the Torah and the prophets are the word of God. So he's not preaching pacifism in that context because he believes everything that's come before him. He's teaching an attitude about avenging yourself when insulted, which is also present in the Torah.
Yeah.
When you're looking at the Quran, when it says fight those who spread fitna in the land, there's no narrative before that explains what the context for that is. So to get that, you have to go to the Hadith, or you have to go to some commentary of somebody who's kind of pulling together the context of this and saying, no, this is the context this is in.
So you have to go to an interpretation, right? Versus what we believe, which is let the Bible interpret the Bible, right? Because it's got its own confines and its own context, like you're saying.
Right. So generally, the average Muslim is asked to defer to an expert scholar in these issues, right? Somebody who understands the context properly. But if you're in the middle of a civil war
Mhm.
between leaders you think are acting corruptly,
Yeah.
then trust your leaders isn't really the best antidote to
Right.
figuring out what the context for something is.
Right.
So I'd say this zeal Muhammad instilled in people, paired with the kind of vagueness of some parts of the Quran, paired with the very important significance he puts on fighting in his lifetime, kind of makes a very explosive setting for any leader, essentially, and that's kind of what happens next. Someone like Omar holds it together for 14 years, because he's a great leader. He's a very effective man. But then after that, once you get somebody who's not competent like Uthman, it all just kind of, all falls apart, and you can't, hold it together, and it just kind of results in clashes.
Got it. Okay, so that took us all the way to, like, historically, up to Shia and Sunni, which are the two largest factions, right?
Yeah.
And we still see those today. Today, which one is the one that is more like, at least what the government tells us, which one's the more problematic one today, the more violent one, I guess you could say?
That's a really complicated question.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's do a roundup here, right?
Yes.
So, Taliban is Sunni. The government of Iran is Shia.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Hamas is Sunni. Hezbollah is Shia.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Right. So you have extremist factions on both.
Interesting.
So and there's lots of there's lots of people who are not extreme on those sides as well.
Right.
So, for example, the government of Saudi Arabia is a U.S. ally and is Sunni. There's a group of Shia called Ismailis who are super chill as well. So you have violent factions within both, and you have peaceful factions within both.
Yeah. So you can't say one is worse than the other in terms of violence or terrorism or anything like that. It occurs on both sides, and you can't hold everybody on that side responsible for the actions of the minority within those factions.
You correct. It's not one faction or another in that regard. Typically, if you're a Shia in a Sunni state, you may face some persecution. If you're a Sunni in a Shia state, you'll likely face persecution as well. So it's like, I think Shias will point to Sunni and say they're more violent, and Sunnis will probably point to Shia and say they're more violent. But you got to take people group by group.
Of course. And then, okay, so as of today, you listed off a few of the different groups there. But as of today, who is there, like a figurehead for each of these, like for the Shia and the Sunni? Or where is the power or the leadership for these two factions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's actually easy to define with the Shia. So there's two main Shia groups in the world. Some people are called 12 Shias, which believe there's kind of 12 imams from a specific line, and there's some people called 5 Shias or Ismaili Shias, who have, like, a different line of succession. For the 12 Shias, the person claiming that position would be the Ayatollah of Iran as the figurehead for 12 Shias around the world. Not every 12 Shia would agree to that, but he has power for a reason.
Sure.
For the 5 Shias, a guy called Aga Khan, who is like, is a London socialite who rides horses, is not like nothing like the Ayatollah. For Sunnis, there really isn't one right now. So you had a caliphate from the time of Muhammad to until actually 1924. So the Muslim world, the Sunni world, has been without a Khilafah for 100 years now, and you had various dynasties ruling that within the Arab world, and then in 1517, 1517, the Ottomans conquered the Arabs and took the title of Khilafah for them, and when Turkey transformed into a secular democracy in 1924, Ataturk abolished the office of the Khilafah and said, Islam will no longer be a religion of sword and politics, it will be a religion of hearts and minds, and there it will flourish. So there's essentially been a leadership vacuum at the sort of very heart of the Sunni world for the last 100 years. Although, to be fair, right, as the Khilafah went on, power got more and more decentralized and became like less important over time anyway, and it just kind of became a figurehead. And so you'd have various people throughout history who would kind of be heroes of Sunni Islam, whether they be scholars or politicians, or scientists or whatever, who people would look to. But you always had that figurehead in place until 100 years ago.
Got it. Okay. So I think that brings us up to today, huh?
Yeah.
Is there anything else you can think of?
There'd be so many other things, but let's.
You're 1,000 pages deep, right? We don't have to.
I could talk about this for I could talk about this for like days, and we shouldn't.
Yeah.
But here's a shameless plug here. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, because we are going to be bringing out some like more in-depth videos on this with all of the sources, referenced to.
Okay, and that was, what was your YouTube channel again?
It's called the Al-Maidah Initiative. I'll send it to you.
Okay. Send it to me. I'll put it down in the description. I'm definitely going to subscribe because this stuff's fascinating to me. Okay, so that brings us up to modern day Islam and events. Okay, I have a random question. Is Gabriel, do you know by chance, is Gabriel also the same angel that the Mormons say appeared to Joseph Smith? Oh, I think he might have froze. Hold on.
No, the hang on, I can hear you now. So the question is Gabriel the same angel that appeared to Joseph Smith in Mormonism?
Yes. Random question.
No. The Mormon claim is that that Joseph Smith was visited by the angel Moroni, who was an angel that used to be a Nephite.
A Nephite. Okay. Sorry. I wanted to clarify because in my head I was like, do they claim the same entity appeared to them? Because it's very similar, like origin stories, right? And it's hard to ignore. It's hard to ignore that. And if you, I'm not trying to generalize, but they've got somewhat similar ideas too in regards to like the polygamy and stuff like that. So it was just, it was just a coincidence, I guess, in history. But what else was I gonna? Oh yeah, hey, do they have in the Quran? You mentioned earlier, it's not like a narrative, where the Bible, it's like Garden of Eden, Abraham, Exodus, Moses, David, Jesus, disciples, right? Today, there's not that kind of narrative or lineage in there in the Quran. It's more so just like bits and pieces of what Muhammad said or what he did. Is the Quran like, is it all revelation and it's just bits and pieces of revelation? Is that kind of how it goes? Because you also mentioned other things like and I guess this segues into the next thing. You mentioned things like the Hadiths or another one with an S, Suris or something.
Sirat literature?
Whichever. So there's different categories of literature. Is it all within the Quran? No. The Quran is just the revelations of Muhammad?
Yeah, so they wouldn't even call it that, right? They'd say that Muhammad has nothing of Muhammad in there. It's just direct dictation from God through Gabriel.
Oh, wow. Really?
Um, and the way it reads, it's not an exact one-to-one, but it reads more like, a combination of Psalms and Proverbs almost.
Hmm.
So, the Hadith is basically basically things that Muhammad said as passed on orally for a few hundred years, then written down later.
Those are the hadiths.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, in Sunni Islam, there's 6 main hadith collections. The 2 most important ones are Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. And basically, there's a guy called Imam Bukhari who went through this rigorous process. They examined 600,000 of these hadith and picked only the sort of 4,000 most reliable ones, which he was completely sure actually went back to Muhammad himself. And so for Orthodox traditional Sunni Muslims, those are basically considered uber important.
Okay. So those are separate. So the Quran's just the revelation, and then there's a separate text. Is it a separate book itself, or is it a part of
a lot of books? So the Quran isn't actually that long. The Quran, as far as its length, is about as long as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John put together.
Oh, wow.
Whereas the Hadith is it's massive. It's vast.
Got it. And the Hadith is not revelation. It's just like wisdom and sayings.
Yeah. So the premise behind it is that Muhammad was the greatest person who ever lived. And if you want to live a righteous life, you should learn everything you can about Muhammad and try and copy him as much as possible. So you need to know about Muhammad's life. So the Hadith is how you do that. And so while they're not considered revelations, it's also, Muhammad's life is kind of this divine, pattern for us. And there are some hadith which are actually considered revelations. Those are called hadith Qudsi, which is when Allah said something to Muhammad, and then Muhammad kind of puts it in his own words. Not many of those, but that's also something that's in there.
Okay, got it. So, so they don't have the same perspective on revelation that Christians have, right? Because we think, what's the verse? The prophet, as he's carried along by the Spirit, right? We don't believe that the Bible is just the prophet or the disciple going into a trance and transcribing what he's receiving from God, right? We believe that he's inspired by the Holy Spirit, uses his own language, his own culture, his own thoughts to present the truths of God, right? And that's totally different than what you're describing.
Right, exactly. So if you look at Mark, I think it's chapter 5, when Jesus is arguing with the Pharisees, he says, you make void the word of God by your traditions. And in Jesus' argument, he fluctuates between Moses said, God said, Moses said, God said, talking about the same stuff, right? So according to Jesus, the Torah is both the words of Moses and the words of God. A Muslim, an Orthodox Sunni Muslim, would never say that the Quran are the words of Muhammad in any sense.
Really? Okay. So they're never going to be like, oh, Muhammad said this while quoting the Quran. They might say it while quoting the Hadith.
Yeah.
Okay.
They will say it when quoting the Hadith.
Okay. Yeah, that's a big distinction. And Muhammad, was he literate? Could he read and write?
There is a lot of debate about that. Most Muslims believe he's illiterate, but there's also this hadith where he asks for a paper and pen as he's dying so he can write something down for everybody and never gets to it. So it's possible he started out illiterate and then became literate later.
Got it.
Or maybe he's asking for a scribe. I think the jury's out on that, but most Muslims believe he's illiterate.
Okay. And so you might have said this earlier, you might have mentioned it. How soon after his initial revelation did he start like writing down the revelations? Do we know that?
Not really.
Not really, huh?
He has scribes in Medina, but it's not. It's certainly not written all in one place, right? If it was written all in one place, we wouldn't have to gather it. Some of it's written, but not everything is written.
Got it. Yeah, that's interesting. So it was written in different places and then gathered and kind of compiled into the Quran we have today. And the who was the guy that compiled it and then got rid of all the others?
That's Uthman.
Uthman.
So he's the third Khalifa. So he burned everything else, and so that would be about like the fourth. I believe that's the fourth year of his reign. So that would be basically 20 years after Muhammad.
After his death?
Yeah.
So Muhammad didn't even have, the Quran wasn't around while Muhammad was alive.
At least not in a concise book form.
Interesting.
So it's Muhammad is leading an oral culture, and as that oral culture grows and becomes an empire, then they start people become more literate and they start writing things down more. And so the Quran becomes, written in response to that.
Got it. And do they have any kind of, I mean, again, from my perspective, from like a Christian background, we've got obviously the Old Testament, which is prophets, wisdom, history, right? And then into the New Testament, and you've got Gospels, which are like the story of Jesus and his sayings. And then we have the letters, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, right? The letters to the churches by the apostles. Do they have any kind of letters that were being written from scribes that Muhammad was kind of like dictating and sending out to different territories? Or is it more so him sitting down with the scribe, writing his like thoughts and his wisdom and his sayings, and that's what the hadiths would be? Is there anything like that where he's writing stuff down to different territories that make it into the hadiths?
Not in the hadith. Those wouldn't be considered hadith, right? So the hadith is not something Muhammad is intentionally being like, all right, write this for everybody, communicate this to people. It's people just sort of observing him and remembering things, right? There are a couple letters that are attributed to Muhammad. One is to a group of monks in the Sinai Peninsula, and then his letters to political leaders. People debate the authenticity of those, though, but that's not what the hadith is.
Got it. And so how many authors are there for the hadiths? Do we even know?
No.
Got it. Do they hold the same weight in the mind of a Muslim as the Quran?
No, but functionally, yes. Depending on which Muslim you're talking to. Because again, if your life is supposed to be modeled on Muhammad, then the hadith are where all those things kind of come from, right? So
got it.
So the Quran talks about praying. The Quran does not say 5 prayers specifically, right? You can kind of construct it from that because they've got an evening prayer, morning prayer, and a middle prayer, but it doesn't specifically say 5.
Right.
5 prayers comes from the hadith. The idea of the 5 pillars of Islam comes from the hadith. So as far as what people are actually like practicing, a lot of it comes from the hadith. So functionally, that's in some ways a more foundational part of what they're practicing than the Quran is for a lot of people.
Interesting. Okay. Cool. Well, is there, I kind of want to get into the context, or not the context, but the, like the beliefs themselves, right? Because again, trying to learn about all this, I know Muhammad, I know the Quran, like that the Quran exists, but I don't actually know, and I know they believe in Allah as God, right? But I don't know any of like the intricacies of what their faith entails, other than what you also just mentioned, that they pray 5 times a day. And that's kind of it. Everything else I know is like government stuff, right? What we've been told. And so what do they think? Do they have salvation Like, what's their means to salvation, right? Is that their goal?
No.
Oh, wow.
So okay. So if you think about like the whole premise of salvation, it's assuming that we are naturally on a course away from God, and we need God to intervene in order for us to be saved, right?
Right.
In Islam, the actual belief is everyone is born pure, and they're actually born Muslim, right? So Muhammad says in the Hadith that everyone is born in a state of fitra or nature. It is his parents that turn him to a Jew or a Christian or a Sabian.
Wow.
So the idea is Islam is the sort of default state of humankind, right? And so the goal then is to keep the purity of your soul through good deeds, through recitation of the Quran, through daily prayers, and maintain that purity. And so then on that basis of this sort of neutrality, when you die, you face this trial of good deeds versus bad deeds, which works in conjunction with God's mercy. So Muslims do not believe that it is your good deeds that get you into heaven by themselves. They believe it's a combination of Allah's mercy, because we all sin, and the good deeds we do. But they wouldn't put it in terms of being saved, because the problem is not as pronounced from the Islamic perspective.
Got it. So you don't need like salvation the way Christians believe. Everyone's evil, right? From birth, sin nature, those kinds of things. They believe humans are born sinless, and then it's like a nature versus nurture kind of thing that takes over, and you're made more and more of a sinner, and you have to counter that by trying to reconnect to your perfect origin.
Yes. So if and also another important thing to think here, right? To understand, according to the Islamic sources, hell is real. There is a hell. If you're Muslim, you can still go to hell, but you won't go to hell forever.
Oh wow! So why would you go to hell?
Well, so let's say when you're weighed on the scales of judgment, you have more bad than good. Then you have to go pay for those bad things. But once you're done paying for them, you go to get paradise because you're Muslim. Also, there's this very interesting thing in the sort of Islamic conception of this, which I always found surprising, is that on the Day of Judgment, you can choose not to forgive somebody for what they've done to you, and if you don't forgive them, they'll go to hell because you haven't forgiven them.
Really?
Again, temporarily, right?
Is there any downside to you not forgiving them? Do you get held in any kind of do you suffer anything as a result of non-forgiveness?
So basically the incentive the Quran uses for this is that you're allowed to take revenge, but it's better to forgive because perhaps maybe Allah will look at your mercy and extend you more mercy. Right? So there is that incentive, but it's nebulous what exactly that looks like.
Got it. And so it also depends, you were saying it depends on, I guess, salvation or heaven for the Muslim depends on also the mercy of Allah. Do they know which way he's going to lean, or can he still, even if the scales are more positive than negative, does he have to extend you mercy?
No, he doesn't have to do anything. So there's a hadith where Muhammad says no one would enter into paradise by his good deeds alone unless Allah wraps them in his mercy. So no one knows, and Muslims in general would say that's kind of the point. They believe that Earth is here. It's called the dunya, which is there to be a test, right? The Quran says, Allah has created you to test which of you is best in deeds. So the idea is, if you know the result of if you know you're going to pass the test, then you're not really working for the test properly. So they're going to say, no, you're not supposed to know that you're going to where you're going, and that's supposed to motivate you to strive for good, basically.
Okay. So there's no like assurance of salvation.
Correct.
Interesting. Man, that's so different than what we're, as a Christian, what we're used to, because we rely on Jesus and on his grace and faith in him. And it's an assurance. It's a guarantee of an inheritance, whereas it sounds like for the Muslim, like you almost have to, you do your best to, it doesn't impress Allah, right? Your good deeds, they don't impress him. So you're just working to get these scales. Are the scales, and I know this could be like metaphor and I'm thinking about it too literal, or maybe it is literal, even in their minds. Are the scales something that like Allah is like holding and he's the one weighing your good versus bad? And then based on that, he decides to give mercy or not give mercy? Or is the scale thing kind of just like a metaphor? Because the Greeks believed in scales as well, and good deeds and being weighed, and the Egyptians. That's true.
So the thing with this when talking about Islam, because the source material is very scattered, putting together the sort of Islamic view of judgment is like putting together, a jigsaw puzzle in a lot of ways. And so there's 3 primary ways that judgment is described. First is the punishment of the grave before you reach Judgment Day. So Muslims believe you're conscious in your grave, and you can either have a good fast experience or a painful long experience as you pay off sins. Then you have the scales of judgment, and then you have something called the Sirat Bridge. And the picture of this is that the bridge to paradise is a mile long and sharper than a sword with the fires of hell below it. And so there's also this crossing of this sort of sword bridge, and people, will fall off into hell based on their good deeds as well. But there's all sorts of ways that talk about, Allah's mercy as well, and multiplying someone's good deeds. And, different Muslims put it together in different ways because there's a lot of data out there,
sure,
basically. And generally, I think, if you take Islam as the way it kind of presents itself, you can always find, holes to poke, and I don't have any problem with poking some holes sometimes. But if you take Islam, how it presents itself, the way it's going to present salvation and your relationship to God is, you do not have assurance. We have a great deal of hope. So there's a hadith that says, Allah says, so this is Hadith Qudsi, one that's considered actual revelation, I am as my slave believes me to be. If he comes to me 1 step, I go to him 100 steps. If he comes to me walking, I go to him running. And so a Muslim is going to be taught that they should be hopeful about Allah's mercy, but never certain.
Okay. And then is that idea of the scales and of this mile-long sword, I guess, pathway or whatnot, is that something they take literally? Or is that kind of the same way? Is that kind of, they're saying the same thing 2 different ways, where good and bad will be judged? You don't know?
I don't know. I don't think anybody knows.
Oh, really?
Again, I've talked to a lot of people about this, and you talk to 10 different people, you get 10 different answers about this. So some people see them as like, overlapping metaphors. Some people see them as like different trials. It's there's a number of ways you can try and fit this together. But again, by the nature of the source materials, it's kind of inevitable that a lot of doctrine becomes like this because, there's so many hadith out there.
Right. Got it. Yeah. And that's, even Christianity has the judgment, where the books are opened, right? And for us, though, it's like the book of life, where God has your name in the book of life. And that's dependent on salvation through Christ, not necessarily good works or bad deeds or whatnot. So for us, we do have like an assurance of salvation, right, which is just, dude, I think Christianity might be the only one that good and bad deeds is not what really saves you,
Right. All other religions, it's a combination of your good deeds and mercy, right? There's not there's not really a deeds alone religion, but there's also not a sort of faith by grace alone religion.
Yeah.
Either.
Yeah. And even, even Christianity, it would be, I think it's in James, right? Faith without deeds is dead.
Yeah.
And so faith would lead to good works, but they're not something that's required by any means for salvation, but they will follow faith, right? So it's pretty interesting, that contrast between the two. What about what is their actual, and I don't know, I love getting into the weeds like this because I actually want to know what they're saying when they say these things like, oh, you're going to go to hell. What's hell? Like, what do you mean by that? Right? What is their hell and what is their heaven?
Okay, so this is actually fascinating because the Arabic word, see if you can catch this. The Arabic word for hell is Jahannam.
Okay, Gehenna.
Yes.
Interesting.
So it's got the Hebrew root word. So it is basically taking the same premise as the Bible, and kind of expanding it, right? A lot more colorful imagery in there, right? Talking about people being bound together by chains in fire, talking about, drinking pus, talking about, torture, talking about, having shoes so hot your brain boils out kind of thing. So like the imagery in the sort of Islamic conception of this is a lot more vivid than it is in the Bible, but it's kind of taking the sort of like whole like Gehenna, lake of fire imagery and just like, all right, now we describe it. Basically.
Sure.
Paradise, Jannah, as they call it, is a little bit more unique. So one thing in Islam is they don't believe the Garden of Eden was on Earth. They believe Adam and Eve were in paradise, and when they sinned, they got sent to Earth as a test. So basically, but you pass that test, you're back to paradise. So,
got it.
In the Bible, it talks about a new heaven and new earth, and Jesus says the meek shall inherit the earth, and the expectation is we live here forever.
Right.
In Islam, it's very much what most Christians end up believing, even though it's not biblical, of this, spiritual eternity somewhere, somewhere else. And it's described in numerous ways, rivers of wine and honey and milk and gardens with rivers flowing underneath them. The virgins thing is real. That's really in the source material for people who die in jihad. No one's making that up. That's a thing. But again, like the judgment thing, you're going to have people who are going to interpret that kind of differently, right? Some people are going to say, well, it's just using 7th century language to describe the amount of bliss there will be rather than it being this, super literal description. So, and to be fair, there's going to be instances in the Bible where we kind of have this, okay.
Oh, for sure.
Right. And so it's like, I think it's really important we as Christians don't use a double standard.
For sure.
We demand nuance and don't allow that to, other people.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. Okay. And then, so the 70 virgins thing is real?
Yeah, it's a real thing.
Is everybody in the same heaven? Like you're all in the same garden? Or does everybody get their own paradise?
In the Islamic sources, there's like 7 levels of paradise. So there's like different neighborhoods. I don't think it's specified whether you can like visit other ones or not. But there is a hadith which says on every Friday, Allah will descend into paradise for Jummah prayers on a Friday. So there is the idea that Allah is present in paradise, but not to the same extent that we see in Revelation, where God's dwelling places with his people. Right. So you see more contact between Allah and his creations in paradise, but not to the extent that you see it in the Bible, which is this complete union of heaven and earth.
Got it. And so we could say that Allah's like, if he's coming down into paradise, he's still outside of paradise by nature, and he comes down into it. And so there's 7 neighborhoods within paradise. Are they, do you get put, are they like, if you're this good, you go to level 1. If you're better, 2. Best, 7. Is it kind of structured like that? Or how do you know where you're going, or what are the qualifications?
I don't think it's like super specified, to be honest with you. There's nothing I've read that's like neatly categorized, but there's things like, dying as a martyr, for example, kind of like best part of paradise. If you die as a martyr, by the way, you skip all the judgment stuff.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Which was always like a powerful incentive for Muslim warriors, right? So if you die as a warrior waging jihad, straight to the highest level of paradise, no punishment of the grave, no scales of judgment, no Sirat bridge, straight to the virgins.
So if you're all in, that's the way you want to go.
Yes, absolutely, that is the way you want to go.
Oh, dude, it's the Vikings. It's Valhalla.
Yes, it is exactly. Yeah. So if you read the Viking battle ethic and the Muslim battle ethic, it's basically the exact same thing, right? It's victory or Valhalla.
Wow.
And the Muslims will say victory or martyrdom. It's and this is the same era too, by the way. The
Very
Muslim
true.
conquest and the Vikings.
Very true.
These are simultaneous forces operating at the same time in human history, both having a, victory in battle or straight to the halls of Valhalla kind of mentality.
That's curious, man, because even, in the New Testament, we're no longer called to any kind of victory in battle type conquests or means of expanding, the gospel by violence. You could say the Old Testament, was not necessarily expanding, because in the Old Testament it was God's people versus.
Right. And even in the Old Testament, right? What does God do? He draws boundaries in Deuteronomy and says, "This is your land."
Right.
He doesn't get, so that you do have the conquest of Canaan for sure, right? God gives them the land of Canaan, and they have to fight the inhabitants and drive them out. Right. That's there. But once they're there, the idea is these are your borders, and there's not a mandate for an Israelite empire at that point.
Right.
And Israel is actually, so when they go to, I believe it's Edom, they want to cross the land to get to where they're going. And Edom refuses, and they actually respect that wish. So the Old Testament's view, while there's more violence in the Old Testament, is not an imperial worldview. It's a worldview that believes in nations and borders, and the nations stay in their place, and you respect that.
Yeah. Do they have genealogies in the Quran or in the Hadiths or anything like that?
No.
Really?
No, absolutely not. Because genealogies are an artifact of written literature. No one remembers that kind of thing over 1,000 years of oral history. Which is again, it's because the Bible is a written work, therefore it has genealogies. And so, if you're memorizing a story, you can memorize. Yeah, and then when Noah got off the ark, his son, he built a vineyard and got drunk, and then Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But it's like, to memorize the genealogies, I might be able to do it. But is the next person I tell? That's going to fall apart real quickly. So because the Quran is an oral document to start with, the Hadith is oral, you don't get that kind of thing.
So how do they trace back to Ishmael?
Yeah, so that is, so the genealogies that you'd have in the Arab society, right? You'd have it in your name. So
got it.
So I would be, so in Arab culture, I'd be James ibn Richard ibn Leslie ibn Charles ibn, right? So son of. Right? So it gets put in your family name. So you do have that kind of genealogy, but not in the sort of scientific. All right, and he was 48 years old when he fathered this person, and he was this old when he fathered this person, right? So it's not that there's no trace of that, but it's all in the sort of like tribe names.
Got it. And so does Muhammad trace his lineage back to Ishmael and Abraham?
So yes, there is sort of a general sense of that in Arab culture at the time, but it's not as big of a deal in Muhammad's time that it becomes later. So, for example, right, the one thing everybody knows about Islam is that they don't believe it was Isaac that was sacrificed; it was Ishmael.
Right.
But that is not in the Quran. That is not in the Hadith.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, and then Al-Tabari, the sort of first big Muslim historian, chronicles that he makes a chronicle of people saying it both ways, right? So Al-Tabari says, yeah, there's 5 people that say it's Ishmael for this reason. These 5 people say it was Isaac, and based on the internal logic of the Quran, Isaac makes more sense.
Interesting. And when was this written? When did Al-Tabari document that?
930.
Oh wow!
AD. So that's 300 years after Muhammad.
Okay.
So it's become a bigger deal over time to the point that everybody just kind of assumes it. But even in Muslim scholarly circles today, they actually will admit we don't know which son Abraham was going to sacrifice.
Got it. So because that's a big deal now, right? Like you're saying, it became a bigger deal, and it's a big deal now. But in the early years, like when Muhammad went and wiped out or conquered those 3 tribes you mentioned, and one of them or 2 of them were Jewish, if I'm remembering it correctly, it wasn't because they saw themselves as descendants of Ishmael and they're destroying the descendants of, it's slipping my mind right now. Isaac. Is it Isaac?
Yeah.
Okay. It wasn't for those reasons.
No.
Whereas now we would be like, oh, or we could read into the past and be like, oh, it's because one saw themselves as descendants of Ishmael and the other of Isaac.
Right.
So they didn't see that.
No, not really. In fact, the Quran clearly speaks of Isaac as a prophet. So there's not. So Muhammad puts himself in the line of the Jewish prophets, right? He kind of connects himself to that legacy, and he connects himself to Ishmael.
Was Ishmael a prophet as well?
In Islam?
Yeah.
Yes.
And Abraham?
Yes.
Huh. Then what? I mean, did the prophets, and this will go into my next one was going to be like, what did they do with Jesus? But did the prophets, because Isaac and Ishmael lived at the same time, right? And hey, so did Abraham. So there was 3 prophets alive on the earth in one family at the same time.
Yeah.
And one prophet went to, I mean, what did the prophets do from a Islamic perspective?
So this becomes this becomes sort of interesting because essentially Muhammad kind of reads back his own struggle kind of on everyone else as well. So Abraham especially, right? So he sees the Quran sees Abraham as this person struggling for monotheism against polytheism, basically. And so, it relates some of the Bible stories of the prophets and will, change others. Honestly, not a lot of the time it doesn't come from the Quran intentionally coming with an agenda necessarily, but maybe because of these stories kind of like picked up traceably through Jewish narrations, which come later.
And then what was the problem? The problem was that they didn't use the right word for God, because like the Jews, they were monotheists, right? And so what was the problem with the existing monotheistic faith?
So basically, the argument the Quran makes is that people have added all sorts of innovation to the religion over time. So firstly, the problem that he's going to allege is that the Jews do not believe in Jesus as a prophet, and that's a problem.
Oh, and the Muslims do.
Yeah.
Oh,
And then part two problem, you don't acknowledge Muhammad as a prophet either. So, if you're truly God's people, you have to acknowledge God's true prophet. And if you don't, it's because you're a hypocrite and don't really know God.
Wow. Okay. So if you don't accept their prophets, you could be monotheistic, but you're off the right path per se. Right.
Okay. Which again, it's kind of the same standard we would have for the Jews at the time of Jesus who rejects him as a Messiah, right? It's
for sure.
Monotheists, but it's not believing that God exists isn't enough. You got to recognize his true voice in the world.
For sure. Okay. So then, obviously, the Muslims believe that Jesus was a prophet, right?
Yeah.
But we believe he was more than a prophet, right? We believe he was the Son of God. And where do the Muslims get their concept of Jesus? Because we've got the words of the disciples, right, and the manuscripts and that kind of stuff, and that's where we get our ideas. But if Muhammad was almost 600 years later, right, there was already a compiled New Testament 600 years in, right, 600 AD. But why do they reject what the New Testament says about Jesus? And kind of just see him as a prophet like any of the other prophets?
Yeah, so basically, the Quran has material on Jesus. So at one point, Muhammad actually claims to have met Jesus as he took a journey into heaven at one point.
Oh, wow.
Called Isra and Miraj. And so basically, the idea is that as Allah is revealing the Quran, he reveals things about Jesus. So there's sort of two things in the Quran about Jesus. So, there's lots of mentions of him. There's two types of information about him, right? One is recalling stories of his life on earth. And then the second part is Allah saying what Jesus is going to say on Judgment Day. So in Surah An-Nisa, Surah Al-Maidah, the 4th and 5th surahs of the Quran, it gets a lot into this, and it will say things like, on the Day of Judgment, Allah will ask Jesus, "Did I say take my mother and I as gods in degradation of Allah?" And Jesus will say, "No, I could never say that, of you. I never said that. They've invented this, basically." So, the Quran essentially puts words in Jesus' mouth that are going to happen in the future on the Day of Judgment.
Okay.
And it also says, the Quran also says that Jesus was not killed or crucified. It was only made to appear that. So it explicitly denies that Jesus is God. It explicitly denies the crucifixion and explicitly, renounces calling Jesus the Son of God.
Those are specifically within the Quran.
Those are in the Quran itself.
Okay, and that is revelation through Muhammad.
Yeah.
From
so
God.
They're saying Allah has said this directly to Muhammad. So that's how we know it, right? And so when they come across the problem of the New Testament contradicting this, what they essentially are forced to believe at this point is that the New Testament was corrupted over time by, take your pick. Christians, the Jews, the Roman Empire, the Persians, Dan Brown, whatever you want to put in there.
Right.
They have to do it. So Islam provides this, it's almost hinted at in the Quran, but it's not really. And as Islam grows out, that's when this allegation of the Bible has been, corrupted, and the Quran has been sent down to, guide you back to the correct path.
Dude, again, very Mormon.
Yeah.
Very Mormon.
This was once the absolute truth.
Correct.
But it's not now. Yep. And you need our leadership in order to be able to tell you what the actual absolute truth is right now.
Fascinating. Okay. And so the Bible that was around during the time of Muhammad, he would have just seen that as tainted and as corrupted.
That, again, it's not all that fleshed out.
Hmm.
So some people are going to say, but one thing you'll see in the Quran is it will say, it will refer to the Torah and the Injil, which are with them, right? So the Quran makes several appeals to the Old Testament and the Gospel, and implies that it's something that people have access to then and there. But again, it's all very much shrouded in mystery. We don't know exactly what text that that Jews and Christians in Arabia would have had, except that, the New Testament as we know it today is referenced in its entirety, in 250 AD by Origen at the very, latest, right?
Right.
The New Testament forms very organically and has been around for a long time. And generally what you see is that the writer of the Quran doesn't really seem to be familiar with the contents of the Torah or the Gospel, but seems very familiar with Jewish and Christian sort of folklore.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, because when I talk to some of these folks, some of these Muslim guys online, like they'll constantly tell me that the Bible has been changed, altered, corrupted, but then they will quote the Bible to me where Jesus is speaking.
Right.
Not always though. Not like John, where he says, "I and the Father are one." Right.
Right.
They won't quote that. That's corrupted. But other passages where Jesus is speaking, that hasn't been corrupted. So, is there any kind of rubric or standard by which these claims are being made, or is it only when it aligns with what their later prophet Muhammad said about Jesus?
That's exactly what the standard is.
That's it, right? Okay.
Every time it aligns up with Islam, exactly.
Okay.
Every time it contradicts Islam, that's a corrupt part.
Got it. So there's no winning that argument, huh?
So not in that sense. So I think the problem in that kind of conversation is that Muslims are essentially trained to think out of context when it comes to the Bible.
What do you mean?
So basically, again, the Quran does not have context.
Right.
As you grow in Islam, right, everything you get just comes kind of verse by verse, idea by idea, bubble by bubble, and there's not a sort of systematic way they kind of connect to each other, right? So when a Muslim reads the Quran and he reads in the book of Numbers where God says, God is not a man that he should lie, or the son of man that he should change his mind. When they read that passage, they're reading it in the context of their own beliefs. Right? So it's like, yeah, this is some isolated thought bubble, which perfectly aligns with all these other isolated thought bubbles that I already believe in. And so they're not really trained to think about the context. Okay, what is the context of Numbers 18?
Right.
Well, the context is Balaam, and it's in the context of God has already physically appeared to several people at this point in the Bible, right? It's not saying that God can't take physical form, but they're ignoring that context and making later Islamic ideas the context for, earlier Christian ideas, right? Which is not the way to read the Bible.
Yeah.
So, like, what this requires as you're talking to people is to have a meaningful conversation about like context, right? And a lot of what I'm trying to do is when I'm talking to people is like, look, I know that you don't believe what I believe. And I know that you think I'm wrong about this. But if you're going to criticize this, you should at least understand what the internal logic for why we believe what we believe is, rather than just treating us like idiots that don't read our own sources.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good, for me right now, light bulbs are turning on, because even some of the debates like I've watched, as I'm trying to learn about the faith and about Islam, a lot of the arguments are kind of like what you're just saying. No respect for the context at all. Just like 5 words strung together completely out of context that are like, and how could that be if God is if Jesus is the Father? You know what I mean? And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
well, hold on. Okay, but what about all this other stuff? Because there's a lot more to that than what you just picked out, you know? But that totally makes sense now that their text doesn't really have like, it's just thought bubbles. It's just these words of wisdom that pop in and out without an actual like narrative or context to them. So for them, they don't have a problem pulling out little bits of information from a text and using it when it lines up with what they believe, right? So that actually makes a lot of sense now.
Right. It's what they've been trained to do their entire life, not just when it comes to discussing what you believe.
Interesting. Okay. And do you find that they're open to, when you have, obviously this is like a ministry of yours, you know, and something you're passionate about, and discussions you probably have like in person with Muslims, do you find that they're open to listening to or learning the narrative and the context, or are they more so interested in just using the sound bites that align with their perspective?
You have a bit of both for sure. But like generally, what I'm trying to encourage people to do, right, is when a lot of Muslims meet you, they have a script of things they think they're supposed to say to you.
Oh, really?
Right.
Like they have a script to say to Christians, a script to say to Jews, or is it just mainly to us?
Mostly Christians.
Okay.
Because the Quran kind of is building this up, right? A lot of the Quran is reacting to Christianity because it's the established world religion, you know, and it's been there for a while. So it's you know, it's kind of constantly kind of reacting to these things.
Got it.
So and then that again, it develops over time, right? So you know, a lot of the time when a Muslim meets you, they'll ask the question, you know, where did Jesus ever say "I am God," or where did he say "worship me"?
Right.
Which all comes from a guy called Zakir Naik, which comes from a guy called Al-Maidah, which comes from this book called Izar al-Haq, which is written in like, you know, British India in the Victorian times. And so you know, if you meet Jehovah's Witnesses, you meet Mormons, it's the same thing, right? They have a bunch of things that kind of like rehearsed arguments of what to say when they meet somebody, you know, in your, you know, position. And what a lot of Christians are going to want to do is they're going to want a sort of counter script to all that. And what I'm trying to get people to do is learn to go off script. Get away from the rehearsed arguments. Talk about things that are like off the beaten trail a little bit. Try and pull out what somebody really thinks rather than what they think they're supposed to say to you. And that's always what I'm trying to do with people. And you know, a lot of that is just in the way you conduct yourself, in the way you present what you believe, right?
Sure.
So as Christians, like, we can trust in the sovereignty of God when we're sharing what we believe. And so we don't need to be pushy about trying to, you know, get people to agree with us. It also means we can listen to what other people have to say without being, you know, afraid we're going to get kind of like Islamic cooties from it.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So the more we can like show an example of actually taking seriously the person, individual, and the worldview in front of us, and interacting seriously and thoughtfully with it.
Yeah.
And not just saying, hey, Aisha was 9. What do you do with that, dude?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, it's like trying to like pin all the worst things about Islamic history on the individual we're talking to, but actually, you know, give them space to be themselves, ask them questions about what they believe. That's where the sort of productive conversations are going to lie.
Yeah, because listen, if we're being fair, they could just do the same thing to us. The Crusades, pedophiles in the Catholic Church, you know what I mean? They don't even know that there's a difference. Well, I shouldn't generalize. Some of the folks I've talked to, they don't even know there's a difference between Catholics and Protestants.
Right.
So every time I'm talking to them, they're like, but the Pope, and I'm like, I'm not Catholic. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. So, you know, golden rule, right? Treat others the way you'd want to be
for sure
treated. So you got to see the individual in front of you and talk to them as an individual, and knowing things to ask question about is helpful. But you can't generalize in these. And
yeah, I feel like we've been very like psyoped, because we've been trained to, as Christians and just Americans in general, to be honest, we've just been trained to like see them as enemy, and to come to these whole groups of people as like fearful or enemy. And the guys I've talked to are like, dude, they're better than most Christians I know. They just have a different God. You know what I mean? And that's one of the things that earlier, like I was saying, I talked to that guy Beck Lover, and one of the things that really stuck out to me, even though we disagree entirely, like on our faith and our religions and who Jesus is and all that, was how much he called for like unity against what's actually tangibly happening here on planet Earth right now, which whether you believe in Jesus as God or not, a lot of people, are coming to the same conclusion that there's some real evil afoot. And so what have you seen, where have you seen like common ground with Muslims as you engage them like in the real world?
So I think like living in Seattle through the 2020s, I think there's a lot of Muslims who are unsettled by a lot of the sort of social agendas, like the sort of LGBTQ agenda, like the trans movement, and especially the way it's kind of taught in schools that I would be as a parent, right? So we have a friend who's an Indian Muslim who is like, this whole school situation freaks me out, in the same way that that we would be uncomfortable with as parents of children here. So there's lots of there are common moral frameworks that we have on some issues with Muslims, and and there's also a big difference. You got to differentiate like Islam from Muslims too, right?
Interesting.
So while I believe Muhammad is ultimately, as a Christian, I'm kind of forced to believe that what he's saying is ultimately blasphemous, at the end of things, right?
Right.
That doesn't mean that the Muslim in front of me, it represents that problem to the same extent as the person who kind of came up with this whole thing is, right? So another example would let me just frame how I think of this, for a minute, right?
Sure.
So I'm in Seattle, which is lawless. There is no truth. Everything is permissible kind of land, right?
Yeah.
And then I'm connected to a lot of people who have escaped from the Taliban, which are religious, hardcore religious Muslims who want to control everyone, right? I don't want that either. And so, the Bible has a problem with both lawlessness and legalism, right?
Right.
Now in the world, right? There's other options. So, for example, the United Arab Emirates is so the Taliban kills Christians, and imprisons them and persecutes them. The United Arab Emirates lets Christians build churches and worship freely, and is a generally free place for Christians to live, and it's ruled by a Muslim dictator. I'm using that word as a technical term, not a slander, right? But he's an absolute ruler of the country, who I would see as mostly a benevolent ruler, especially for Christians, right? So someone like Sheikh Zayed of Dubai is somebody we can have a great deal of friendship with and cooperation with, right? You don't want to be ruled by extremists. I don't want to be ruled by extremists. You don't want to be lawless and licentious in your society, we don't want that either. You want law and order and peace in your civilization. We want that too, right? So when we're trying to build a sort of society, we can have a great deal of cooperation with people like that. There's also things you kind of can't do together, right? So I could serve with a Muslim on the Seattle City Council, at least with some Muslims, and I could say, we could say this Marxism stuff is insane. The sort of rampant immorality in our city needs to change. The way we're treating, homeless people here is enabling people, not helping people. Right. I literally just had that conversation with the Yemeni woman, last week, who wants to put together a coalition about this. And we could do all those things in the sort of society we're in, and we could accept help from them. They could accept help from us, right? All those things are possible. If I could even start a business with a Muslim, right? I have a Saudi friend who we talk about starting coffee shops sometimes. Both of us want a hospitable environment that serves good coffee and is classy and modern, is open really late, right? Yeah. Those things you can all do with somebody. But we couldn't start a place of worship together, right? We couldn't. Okay, we might even be able to start a school together if you have, if we have. Okay, we want a thorough knowledge of Christianity and Islam. Maybe we can pull that off.
Yeah, if it's like purely academic.
Yeah.
Why
not? But then, when you get to a place of worship, you can't do that, and you'd have a really, really hard time like building a state from the ground up. Because you can't split between Christian and Muslim values. They're like different things. There has to be a host culture, ultimately, right?
Yeah.
So with a Christian host framework, you can have Muslims come and be a part of that. And so if you see America as a sort of Christian legal framework, which it is, because British common law comes from Alfred the Great, which comes from Deuteronomy, like explicitly. So one man, one woman, right, is a Christian legal framework. So when we have new Afghans here, we've intervened in several Afghan domestic situations where the husband wants to kind of control his wife and keep her at home and make her wear the veil all the time. And what we explain to people living here is like, look, if your wife wants to stay home all the time and wear a veil, she's welcome to do that. She's free to do that. If she doesn't want to do that and you're making her do that, you are committing a crime here, right? And we will make sure you get prosecuted for that.
Yeah.
Right. And so at that point, you have a Christian host culture, which can welcome Muslims to an extent, and where a Muslim can be, free and happy and actually practice what they believe within certain limits. There's other things they couldn't do, like marry 4 wives, for example, right? And in the UAE, which is a tolerant Muslim country, there are ways I could mostly live as a Christian, but I couldn't go and hand out tracts on the street there, right? So there's always kind of like limitations to that,
sure,
and there's opportunities, and understanding what the differences are and what you can and can't do together is actually key for actually being able to build a sort of harmonious relationship.
Cool. Nice. What do you think? Okay, so we obviously have, when we look at Christian or Muslim, when we look at what's going on, we're pretty opposed to this rampant debauchery and over-sexualization of children and certain agendas that are being propagated right now, right? This is a little off track here, but why do you think that the Muslim community sometimes goes left, on these issues, or at least sides with the left, who are the ones pushing these issues?
Yeah. So, I think a big reason for that, and I've observed this a lot, because again, I'm doing this in Seattle, where I see this.
Oh yeah, especially right now with a lot of the protests that are going on.
I have a friend who's running for city council on a left-wing platform and is Muslim. Right? So I see this a lot, and I think there's a few things, right? The first is this: there is kind of a base compatibility there, and it starts with the innate goodness of a human being.
Interesting.
So Islam has this idea of the fitra, this innate sense of good, and the left wing generally views people as a blank slate, which is defined by their environment.
Right.
So both of those things have the central premise in them that the human experience is going to be fundamentally changed if you have the right environment to live in. So in the Muslim framework, it's going to be, raised by Muslim parents, proper immersion in a Muslim community, your recitation of the Quran, 5 daily prayers, that sort of stuff. And, the left wing view is going to be like, okay, well, you're not poor, you're educated properly, right? And so a lot of those things are not like necessarily contradictory to each other. So those can like fit together quite, well. And if you believe in just kind of establishing the right environment, then that tempts you towards revolutionary thinking, because you see so many of the problems in the world as being a result of the system. And if you can just tear the system down and replace it with a better version, then life will be better.
So they don't necessarily want the same ends, but they agree on the means of getting to that end.
Right. So we went to the Palestinian protest at the University of Washington campus a few weeks ago, and we talked to a bunch of people there. And if you kind of like talk to someone with a like typical Hamas worldview, what they want is the current system of the world to be torn down and replaced with a caliphate, right? Caliphate. That's what they want. The left-wing protesters there want the abolition of the state of Israel and the United States, and basically all lands back in the control of indigenous people.
Okay.
Right? Now, both ultimately agree that the existing system needs to be torn down.
Got it.
Every other battle can be fought later.
Right.
But when you're working together in that type of terminology, in those kind of terms, then there's a lot of kind of cross-pollination as well. So it's not that Muslims are pretending to have left-wing ideas so that they can co-opt left-wing support.
Right.
People genuinely have those ideas and don't see the contradiction between them a lot of the time. And a lot of that simply is that after 9/11, the right was scared of Muslims and the left reached out. I'd actually say that's a failure of the right wing in the country. People who could have been natural friends on some issues, right, end up turning into political enemies because we didn't do enough to stop us from alienating people.
Right.
So
yeah, that's a really good point.
Most Muslims before 9/11 voted Republican. Because they're generally people who believe in family values. For
sure. And that's why this is so confusing to me, because it's like, I feel like conservatives and Muslims have way more in common, especially today, than they do with like the progressive left. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Now, on a practical level, how they want to live their lives, that's true. But as far as their views about like human nature and their expectations of what the government's supposed to do,
yeah,
both Muslims and liberals have higher expectations of what the government could be than what conservatives do. So there are some sort of natural ways those things can kind of like fit together
for the time being.
for the time being, right?
Right.
And so and then part of it is just because of liberals tend to be the people who've been paying attention to the wounds that Muslims have,
sure,
and therefore build real friendship and partnership with people.
Yeah, it makes sense now that you explain it, because before I just thought it was like they're co-opting the movement towards their own ends, but the way you're explaining it is that they actually do fundamentally have uh the same view on like human nature, which is pretty interesting. Um but they definitely both want completely different ends, right? Like the liberals, the progressives, they want to undo the system, and they literally want to liberalize. I don't know if that's a word, but let's go with it. They want to liberalize humanity, right? Let people be people, whatever you want, because and this is based on what you said. This is really curious. If we're good, anything that comes out of humanity is for the good, because you're being your authentic self, right? Whereas the Muslim would say we're good and we need a government and a society that imposes these rules and this caliphate to keep humans good. Is that a proper way of looking at it?
Yes. However, one element we should also add to this, right? We talk about this whole idea of thinking about everything out of context, right? So, if a great many Muslims are disconnected from the context of what they believe, it's also they're well prepared to kind of keep Christian ideas out, but they're not always well prepared to keep other ideas out, right? So, if you're a Muslim from the Middle East living in the West, and you hear people talking about the problems of imperialism and colonialism, then it's easy to just kind of incorporate that into your sort of existing worldview, because you don't study the history, you don't realize that Islam is inherently imperialist and colonialist, right? It's built on expansion, conquest,
for sure,
and making everyone speak Arabic in order to pray and read the religious literature.
For sure,
it's a colonial exercise, very literally.
Yeah.
But people are not held to that standard, because you're not going to, you're not going to come across that in the Quran. You're not going to be told, yeah, we're the colonists, right? But what people have experienced is like real pain from European colonialism. So it's easy to kind of like connect those bubbles together, and it makes a very compelling worldview for somebody, that this anti-imperialist thinking and Islam and anti-colonialism all kind of fit together well. When they don't, if you're taking an honest look at it, but it's easy to do that. So these ideas kind of infiltrate in and become a real core of who people are.
Interesting. Then it just makes me wonder, because I mean, obviously, another thing that I know about Islam is that they're not friendly to the LGBTQ plus community. But then you have a bunch of those people, at least what we see online, right, which isn't necessarily always reality. But you have a bunch of those people like associating with like the Palestine movement and stuff like that. So is it kind of, when it comes to things that they're opposed to, but they're embracing of them at the moment, is that kind of a means to an end, where it's like we have the same goal for the moment, so we will align with whoever's on board, and then we'll cross the bridge when we get there, if we can achieve that goal that we're working towards together.
So that's part of the picture, but it really isn't the whole picture, right? So let's say you have a cynical thought leader movement who decides to do that. There's not like one giant Muslim WhatsApp thread where everybody collaborates on these kind of things.
Right.
It's not that systematized. So let's say you have, a cynical manipulator who's trying to kind of get these groups together, but knows in the end that, when we have power, then we'll do away with you, right? Let's say you have that person, but then the actual movement is going to be based on 100,000 Muslim college students and 200,000 liberal college students. As those, give me a second here. I actually need to plug into power. Okay, sorry about that.
No, no worries. You were saying, so if there's 100,000 Muslim students, 200,000 like liberal students.
So, okay. So as those Muslim students, those liberal students hang out together, inevitably they make friends with those people and they share ideas with those people and they absorb ideas for each other. So Islam kind of gets corrupted by or diluted through this other movement they're in partnership with.
Sure.
So you do actually so you don't get Muslims who pretend to be liberals for points, although you do have those. I'd say the vast majority of people who are sort of sincerely connected to each other, much like in the same way that Christianity became compromised with that kind of thinking. That's happening in the Islamic world as well.
Yeah. Okay. I believe you. But, it's the perspective. And that's what a lot of people think and believe, because it just seems so opposed to one another. But yeah, I could believe what you're saying as well. It makes sense, especially when you look at it foundationally, that both perspectives come to it from this idea that humans are good by nature,
Right.
And I'm curious if are there any other religions? I'm just thinking out loud now. Are there any other religions that say humans are evil by nature or have sin nature or something akin to that, like Christianity does?
Not really.
Not really, right? Man, we've got a lot of like novel concepts in Christianity that are ours alone.
Yeah.
Curious, Well, man, I think that's it for the most part. I've got a whole new paradigm now when engaging with these things, because I was uninformed. You know what I mean? I just had certain ideas and like biases. And now a lot of the responses and the ways people were communicating with me from that faith, now they actually make a lot more sense. You know what I mean? I guess the last question I would have, since for me personally, I'm doing this to learn so that I could continue to engage people more effectively. What has been, you said a little bit earlier, you've seen success when people sit down and actually engage with the person across from them, right? And get to know them and befriend them. And for me, I was always like more factually based, like, okay, you're telling me the Bible's been corrupted. Where? When? Why are you quoting from it? Like I'm trying to get data, you know what I mean? And kind of like build a case. Is that the best way to go about these kind of engagements? Or is it more just befriend and have organic conversations? You know what I'm saying?
I don't think those things are opposed to each other at all. But what I would, for me, right, I'm very much sort of data driven myself, right? I want to understand why people think the way they think.
Me too.
So I think the key to that is to kind of keep going as deep as you can. And one of the biggest questions that you should be asking any Muslim you're talking to, honestly anybody you're talking to, is where are you getting your information from? Right? Did you actually, look at this yourself and this thing popped out to you and you're saying that? Or Jesus asked Pilate, do you say this of your own accord, or did somebody tell you to ask me this?
Right.
Like that's the kind of question you should be asking, because that's where you start to get to the sort of substantive things, right?
Yeah.
Because the conversation we're pretending to have is, do you trust the Bible or the Quran?
For sure. Because I've got no leg to stand on if I can't be like, yeah, man, but the Bible says, and they're like, that's corrupt. And I'm like, but why are you saying that? Show me where the corruption happened. Because here's the manuscript from like 80 years after the apostle died. It's saying the same thing as we're saying today. Where did the corruption happen?
So the important thing about like dealing with that is you have to understand what authority they're actually standing on. And they're not standing on the authority of a book that they read and know thoroughly. They have in fact been told their entire life, you, the individual Muslim, are not a scholar. and you are not qualified to understand the
Interesting.
Quran and the Hadith yourself, you must go to somebody who's trained in the sciences, a scholar, a mentor, or a guide, right? So if you're not a scholar who's gone through the proper training in Arabic and Hadith science and everything, your job is to trust the scholars, right? So now it's not that they're necessarily directly following the scholars, but they have a framework where they're trained to sort of like trust the group, basically.
Right.
Muhammad says, "My community will never agree upon an error." There's Allah's hand is over the group, and whoever diverges from the group diverges to hell. Like that's in the Hadith. So I had one of the best conversations I had about this. I was on a flight from Istanbul to LAX, and I was sat next to this Palestinian woman, and I asked her, where do you get your information about Islam from? And she said, honestly, I'm having a hard time with this because all of the scholars are on the payroll of some government somewhere, and I don't trust the governments that pay them, so why would I trust the scholars?
Wow.
And then
that's
later,
honest.
Yeah. And then later on, she asked me about 4 hours in, it's like, okay, I have a question for you. You're Christian, I'm Palestinian. What do you think about Israel and Palestine?
Yes. All right, here we go. We got there, folks. 2.5 hours in.
So what I said to her is, first of all, you got to look at why God chose Abraham. He said, through you, I'm going to bless all the families, all the tribes, and all the nations of the earth. When God chose Israel, it was never to the exclusion of everybody else, but it was for the good of everyone. For sure. Right?
There was a portion of the temple of the outer courts dedicated to the sojourner, to the outsider, to the non-Jew. Like that was incorporated in the temple system.
Yeah.
And
it was never licensed to treat non-Israelites wrong. Actually, it was a mandate to treat them well.
Right.
So there's an instance, and I read of this,
right,
where in 2 Samuel, where God demands the blood of the house of Saul because Saul persecuted the Gibeonites, and what it says is his zeal for the people of Israel. Right? And so he used David to bring justice in that situation.
Right.
But I explained to them that the main reason Israel was there was to bring about the salvation of the world through the Messiah. And I explained the sacrificial system to her, the Passover, the sacrifice of Isaac, and read her the promise of this sacrifice for the whole world in Isaiah 53. And I said, Jesus claimed to be this sacrifice so that if you trust in him, all of the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob can belong to you too. And she said, that's really interesting, but I've been told the Bible's corrupt. I said, who told you that? She said, the scholars.
The ones that she doesn't trust.
Yeah, so I said that. It's like, the ones you don't trust? Do you trust them when they tell you that? And she says, I don't know.
Wow.
So this is not about the words of Yahweh versus the words of Allah.
Right.
It's about the words of God versus the words of men.
Right.
And that's the conversation we need to be having with people when we get to these foundational issues.
Did we say this earlier? Does the Quran itself say that the Bible is corrupt? Or the Hadith?
It's going to depend on who you ask. I don't think it does. There's other people who, one of my co-workers who was Muslim is now Christian, thinks it does. We haven't got to the point where we've figured that out yet. So
can you think of the passage or whatnot that can be interpreted one way or the other? Like
the reference I can't think of the top of my head, but it basically it sort of claims if Jews bringing forward false scriptures, basically. But there's an early Islamic commentator called Ibn Abbas who says no, this is they distort it with their words. The actual manuscripts are exactly as Allah revealed them.
Interesting.
So there's been debate in the Muslim world over time about this as well.
Yeah.
But there's plenty of instances in the Quran where it says that Allah sent the Torah and the Gospel. If they have questions about what they believe, let them consult the Torah and the Gospel, which are with them, like a present book, not something that's like way in the past. So you can make a pretty solid argument, I think, that the Quran is appealing to the Bible as if it's still true.
So why would you mentioned earlier in our conversation that there's a passage that says something about like the people of the book will be made to convert or pay taxes or something. It might have been in that portion of the conversation, but now it says to like speak to the people. If you have confusion, speak to the people of the book. What what changed?
Well, this is so actually. I mean, those two aren't necessarily like contradictory to each other, but the talk to the people of the book passage comes first.
So being like accepting or talking to them if there's any confusion, that comes first, and then later comes they'll convert.
Yeah. So, but that again, it's not. You can pay tax and remain a Christian or a Jew, right? So and the Muslims are expected to protect you. So when Muhammad took over Medina, they have a charter which gives Jews protection to maintain their religion. So in Islam, there's always been a space for Muslims and Jews and Christians to actually have conversations with each other, and there's instances in Muhammad's life where he did. So there were some Christians in a place called Najran, which is South Saudi Arabia. They came up to meet Muhammad, and they basically argued for 3 days. They did not convert to Islam, and he let them kind of pay taxes and stay living there. On his deathbed, he said, I want to drive all non-Muslims out of Arabia and leave only Muslims. And Omar carries that out and does deport those Christians later.
Wow.
But that's just from Arabia itself. So in the Muslim framework, there is room for Christians to live in that society as well.
Would that on his deathbed, was that a revelation, or was that like would be considered a hadith?
Hadith.
Okay. Do you still have time? I have one more question.
Time.
Okay, cool. Hey, I forgot to ask this earlier, and maybe I'll like take it from the back end and put it on like in a more proper place in the conversation. So Muslims also have like prophecies, right? Like end times prophecies.
Okay, yeah.
Nice. Okay, what are they expecting? Like the Christian perspective's it's been around forever and everybody knows it, right? And like, geez, America especially, that there's going to be like an end of the world, there's going to be an antichrist, a mark of the beast, a rapture, things, Jesus comes back, right? Those are kind of the primary tenets of Christian eschatology or end time stuff. What are like Muslim or Islamic prophecies about the end times?
Okay, so there's also an antichrist.
Okay,
Masih ad-Dajjal, who will be waging a war against the Muslims. And there'll be a guy called the Mahdi, who is sort of chosen by Allah to kind of like fight against him. And then Jesus will come back over Damascus.
Jesus will?
Jesus will.
Not Muhammad?
Not Muhammad, Jesus. Because Jesus never died in the Islamic framework. So he did ascend to heaven, and he's going to come back over Damascus.
Oh, man, so many questions.
And the Hadith says he'll break the crosses and kill the swine, meaning that he'll like abolish Christianity and all the Christians will become Muslims.
Wow. So do they think the Antichrist is Christian?
They believe he has one eye. There's not like a ton of other. They give a lot of like physical details of him, but not like a bunch of like actual, worldview details.
Okay, but if he's coming to break the crosses and whatever the swine, the Mahdi is coming to do that, you could assume that if he's warring against the Antichrist might be the one perpetuating the crosses.
Might be.
Interesting.
So Jesus will be the one to kill the Antichrist. Then I believe Gog and Magog will kind of come and attack. Come and sort of be unleashed. And then Allah will, and no one knows this, but it's in the Hadith. Then that all ends. The world ends by Allah sending this sort of gentle, sweet breeze that kills everyone.
What? Everyone?
Everyone.
Huh.
And then that is the ushering into the eternal state.
Oh, so that would be their new heaven and new earth, kind of?
Yeah.
Okay.
So everyone has to die before that happens, including the righteous people. So it's kind of like, so the idea is you're kind of like put to sleep sweetly, and then you're in the eternal state.
Yeah.
And then it's Judgment Day.
Dang. Okay, so what does the Mahdi do?
It depends who you ask.
He's not Jesus, right?
He's not Jesus.
These are separate people?
Yeah, so he's basically the leader of the Muslims against Masih ad-Dajjal. So he's the kind of the one, leading the fight until Jesus gets there.
Okay, so he's the one leading the fight until Jesus gets there, and then Jesus is the one that destroys the Antichrist.
Yeah.
Okay, and then it's the paradise. It's the breath of God and paradise.
Yeah.
Are there anything else? Do they have any kind of how can I put it? Like we've got revelation, and it's like this will happen, then this will happen, then this will happen, then this will happen. This guy appears, there's this battle, then this happens, and this. Do they have any kind of like narrative or systematic events that need to unfold, or is that kind of just all you get?
So they do talk about major signs and minor signs of the end times. And it's going to depend who you talk to. So there's the imam of the local mosque near me believes that Israel being made a nation again is a major sign of the end times. Really?
Is that that's just his personal opinion, or is that like
personal opinion? I haven't been shown a source for that. And again, the difficulty with this is it's all come from the Hadith. So there's several different ways to kind of assemble it. And so if you look at Muhammad's eschatology, there's 3 predictions in the Hadith about the future of the Muslim nation. All of them were completely different, or at least, or maybe somebody can synchronize them all. But one says the Khilafah will last for 30 years and then become an imamate. It become kingship after that, right? And that tracks with the actual historical timeline of how things happen. Another one says Muhammad says there'll be 12 Khilafah, and then it will kind of all of them from the Quraysh, and then it will collapse. That did not happen. And there's another one that says that the Khilafah will remain with the Quraysh even if there are 2 people left on the earth, which that's not true. That became untrue in 1517 when the Ottomans took the caliphate. So, again, piecing this together is very complicated because the sources are so vast, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the takeaway on basically every Islamic doctrine that there is. The source material is vast. You're not going to get a unified answer on these things, and you need to be able to, ask questions to the person you're talking to.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting, and that there. So does Jesus come back and destroy the cross and the swine, or is that's what Jesus does?
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so one of the perspectives that goes around in the Christian community or circles is that, and I might not be, quoting this exactly right, but that there is an overlap between, I think it's the Mahdi and the Christian Antichrist, right? So that we're speaking past each other. They're looking at our Savior as their enemy, and we're looking at their Savior as our enemy. You know what I'm saying? Or Antichrist, if you want to use that language. What do you think about that?
I don't personally believe it. I dug into this a little bit, last year. And a lot of the things people say, okay, this is what the Antichrist does, this is what the Mahdi does. The details of the Mahdi are really sparse. There's really not that much data on who he is and what he does in the Islamic source materials. Now, can you find Muslims who will say things about the Mahdi that line up with the Antichrist? Sure. But do I think Muhammad is like prophesying the future Antichrist as as the actual savior of the world. No, I don't think that. I also personally, like from my interpretation of the Bible, I don't really believe there'll be an Islam in the end times. I think all of the Muslim nations will be predominantly Christian by the time that Jesus returns.
Really? Are you like post-mill?
I wouldn't say I'm post-mill. I would say that I'm like pre-mill with post-mill sauce.
Sounds delicious.
Yeah, I know it is. It really is. But like for me, right? I'm not like super married to an eschatological camp. I just want to take all of the data in the Bible and believe it.
Yeah.
But where I point you to is first is Psalm 72, which talks about the kingdom of the Messiah and talks about the kings of Sheba and Seba bringing gifts. Where are Sheba and Seba? Saudi Arabia and Yemen. You talk Isaiah chapter 60 or maybe 61. It talks about all the flocks of Nebaioth, all the multitudes of Kedar, all the inhabitants of Sheba coming to Israel with gold, spices, and good news. So there's this picture in Isaiah about the Messiah's reign where the Arab peoples are coming to Israel bringing the gospel. And in that same passage, it talks about, it talks about the gospel going out, the news of God going out to the nations, starting with Tarshish, right? Starting with Tarshish. Now, who is the person that God chooses as the apostle to bring the gospel to the nations? Paul of Tarsus, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so that prophecy, which talks about the multitudes of the nations, right? Anytime it names nations in these prophecies, it is naming countries that are currently Muslim countries. So I expect to see a broadly Christian Saudi Arabia before Jesus comes back.
Dang.
And that's my personal expectation. I would see the Antichrist more like as a sort of like the Antichrist figures in the past have always represented this sort of human imperial power more than anything, right? It's this man who wants to see himself as God,
right?
And that's what I expect the Antichrist to be like.
Yeah,
I don't think Muhammad correctly predicted that. I think when the end comes, there'll be two options: the true Christianity, or one big false idea. I don't think we'll have as much division left. I think there'll be one big one.
Yeah, interesting. Are you, speaking of one big religion or deception, are you familiar with Baha'i?
Yes.
What do you think about that? Well, if people aren't, do you want to give us a snapshot?
Yeah, okay. So if people want to deep dive on Baha'i, I'd really recommend the Cultish series on Baha'i that they put out.
Oh, nice. I didn't even know they have one.
Yeah, it's good. But basically, Baha'i is kind of like a new age religion that actually came out of a stream of Islam, and basically is trying to say, all the prophets of the religions were, leading up to this one, which is kind of this kind of universal religion. But they do have some specific ideas about who should be, ruling the world. So it kind of starts in Iran, headquarters is in Jaffa, Israel. It's kind of an offshoot of Islam, but doesn't really have much in common with Islamic theology.
Who do they think should rule?
I can't tell you off the top of my head.
No, huh?
But someone associated with their organization, probably.
Of course it is. So yeah, they're just trying to unify Christians, Jews, and Muslims because they say that we all originate from the Abrahamic faiths, and we're all we're one, right?
Yeah, you're all completely right, and you're all wrong at the same time. So join us.
Exactly, because we're right.
Yeah,
so funny. Okay. Last question I have. You mentioned it earlier. So they think Jesus was raptured. He didn't die. They think he was taken up. Were any other prophets taken up, or just Jesus?
I'm not sure off the top of my head. But yeah, the Quran specifically says he did not die, nor was he crucified. He was made to appear to them. Allah raised him to himself.
Interesting. It's so fascinating that he's the one that comes back in the end times.
Yeah.
And we say the same thing, but to a completely different end.
Yes. Funnily enough, the everything the dying in appearance is actually seems to be kind of taken. It probably doesn't originate from Islam itself. It actually probably originates from the Gnostics.
What does?
This idea of Jesus not being crucified, but only happening in appearance.
Okay.
There's a Gnostic work called the Discourse of the Great Seth, which is the most unhinged thing I've ever read.
Wow.
It's like some Gnostic mystic, taking LSD and like channeling the words of Satan directly.
Wow.
I'm honestly like reading this thing. I believe you. I've never read anything that feels more like the unfiltered thoughts of Satan than the Gnostics. It's like crazy.
What is this one called that you're referring to?
The Discourse of the Great Seth.
How old is this, or when was it written?
300-400 probably. AD?
That early?
Yeah.
Dang.
And so there's another Gnostic text which has the story of Jesus turning clay birds into a real bird. That makes it into the Quran as well.
Really?
So again, another shameless plug here. On our channel, we have a video which is 45 minutes long called Jesus in Islam versus Jesus in Christianity.
Oh, that's great.
Outline all this with the direct references so people can like look that up themselves.
Dude, that's great. I'm gonna watch that for sure right after this. Good stuff, man. I really appreciate it. I've learned so much. I'm ready to engage more, but not really. I'm also super scared because I don't really understand it too much. But I'm gonna use your resource a ton. I'm probably gonna start like binging your guys' videos. Do you have a lot of like informative content on there?
Yes. So where I would highly recommend anybody who wants to kind of like have informative content start.
Yeah.
We have a podcast. We talk about, issues. You probably don't want to go through a whole backlog and watch everything unless you're like really hungry to do this. Where I would start is number one, we have a playlist called Al-Maidah Academy, which is the much more sort of structured things that we put a lot of research in with a lot of citations in. I think I kind of consider that my best work. If you want something a little bit more digestible, we have a series called Ask Al-Maidah, which we answer kind of questions mostly asked by Muslims.
Wow, cool.
And sometimes, by Christians about Islam. And those would be the place that I'd recommend starting if you want to kind of get an informative, view on this.
Very cool. Yeah, I've got, I think I messaged you when I reached out. I've got like this, I don't know what he is. I don't know if he's like a scholar or imam. I don't know. But he wants to come on. He reached out through YouTube, or a friend of his reached out and connected us. And he wants to come on and discuss, I don't know. I'm sure he's just going to discuss his faith. And I just, honestly, I'm like, now I'm so curious because I'm inquisitive. And like you said earlier, I want to know why people believe what they believe, and I'm sure I'm not good with like verses. So if somebody says something that sounds off to me, I'm not going to be like, well, Deuteronomy 4:8 says, I can't do that. But I've got a good understanding of the Bible. So when somebody says something, I'll be like, yeah, but the Bible says, and I'll be able to kind of give a gist of what it's saying, So if this guy comes on, he's probably going to wreck me. I'm not trying to debate him or anything like that, but I'm sure he's going to like give his perspective. And I'm curious to see, I just want to ask like what you were kind of saying. Why do you believe that? Where are you getting that information from? Can you give me like a trajectory historically of what you're saying? Or is it just more so opinion and personal belief, So I'll be curious to see what happens.
Yeah, me too. Let me know when that's out. I'll watch it.
Okay. Because this was great. I'm like, I've been encouraged for the conversation, and maybe I might even, if I get this uploaded in time, maybe I'll even tell them to watch this before coming on to ours. You know what I mean? Because who knows? I'm genuinely intrigued by their community, and to some degree, I really like respect their fervor. You know what I mean? And I think we do have a lot that we can unite against in this day and age, while connecting and having like genuine relationships with people. So yeah, I appreciate you coming on, James. And I'll definitely,
thanks for having me.
I'll plug all your stuff down below so people could find it. And I'll keep you posted how things go over here on my end. Okay.
Great. Thank you.
All right, brother. Have a good day.
You too.
Okay. Talk to you later.
Bye.